Hello, my name is Will Spencer and welcome to the Will Spencer Podcast. This is a weekly show featuring in-depth conversations with authors, leaders, and influencers who help us understand our changing world. New episodes release every Friday. Okay, so get this. What if the most beloved band in history wasn't just a music group, but a sophisticated psychological operation designed to rewire an entire generation's mind? I'm talking about the Beatles, a band I've never particularly liked, but now understand represents something far more sinister than just another overrated musical act. In 2020, I stumbled across a YouTube documentary that blew my mind wide open. It was Mike Williams' 4-hour deep dive, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? Now, I don't know how I found it. Maybe someone shared a link, or I was down some internet rabbit hole about the Paul is Dead conspiracy. Those rabbit holes can be pretty wild, as we all know. But something about this documentary was different. When I hit play, everything I thought I knew about pop culture started unraveling in real time. Now look, I'm the guy who's always gotten eye rolls when I say I can't stand the Beatles. Everyone loses their mind. My 8th grade graduation literally used Imagine as our song. Talk about forced cultural indoctrination, right? It's like we were programmed from day one to worship these 4 guys from Liverpool. But this documentary revealed something way bigger than just musical taste. What if the Beatles were the first and most successful experiment in mass cultural engineering? Think about their trajectory. They start as these seemingly innocent, mop-topped kids singing bubblegum pop. Clean cut, harmless, parents love them. And then, almost overnight, they transform into these countercultural icons, pushing psychedelic drugs, Eastern mysticism, and radical social change. It wasn't an accident. It was a carefully orchestrated plan. Imagine a plot so precise that it could take 4 seemingly innocent musicians and use them to introduce a radical cultural shift to millions of unsuspecting people. So if you ask me, Mike Williams didn't just make a documentary. He uncovered a blueprint for how pop culture can fundamentally reshape society. How many millions of people turned on, tuned in, and dropped out because of the Beatles? How many doorways to cultural revolution did they open? And let's be real, this wasn't just a one-time thing. This became a template. Look at modern pop stars. Katy Perry, Taylor Swift, Britney Spears, Miley Cyrus. They all follow the same pattern. Start innocent, build an audience, then gradually deconstruct everything that made them initially appealing. The Beatles were the original prototype, the proof of concept for this entire model of cultural manipulation. So since that documentary, Mike Williams has carved up the Beatles mythology like a psychedelic turkey, exposing a level of cultural manipulation that's both horrifying and fascinating. His videos have been viewed millions of times, and he's done something most people wouldn't dare: systematically dismantled one of the most protected narratives in modern music history. When I reached out to have him on the podcast several months ago, I knew more people needed to hear this story, not just as music history, but as a case study in how culture is truly manufactured. And my guest this week isn't just talking about the Beatles, but revealing how 4 musicians became one of the most sophisticated psychological operations of the 20th century. From the Mike Williams Paul is Dead channel, please welcome Mike Williams. Mike, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you very much, Will, for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
You know, I found your first Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music video 4 years ago, not too long after you published it. And I had never really thought much about the Beatles. I didn't much enjoy their music. I couldn't figure out why they were such a big deal. But then I watched your video and it just started unraveling a whole bunch of different things for me. And so now here we are 4 years later. You've produced a whole ton of content around that. And so it's the perfect time to sync up and share this with my audience.
Well, especially you and I spoke before we got going with the show that I'm retiring the research effective this November 9th. So it's a nice way to kind of wrap it up. I can talk about it, I can summarize it, and give the audience a broad perspective on what the research was all about.
Yeah, so you've been doing this research for 8 years. So what you put together in 2020, in April of 2020, you are already halfway into the process, correct?
Yes. Yeah, so the research began in earnest back in the latter part of 2016. So what happened was, in early 2016, I bought this book. It was a different edition at the time. It was a red cover. It's the Memoirs of Billy Shears. And I stumbled upon the book. Will, I was on Amazon and I was just perusing for books and it popped up as a recommendation. And so I took a quick look at it. I didn't know anything about the book. I know nothing at the time. I knew nothing about the author or the encoder, Thomas Hugh Harriot. And so I read the little write-up on it, and I thought, well, this looks interesting. Because I was aware of the Paul is Dead conspiracy going back to when I was a kid, going back into the 1970s. And I didn't believe that Paul McCartney was replaced. I didn't believe Paul McCartney died. I knew the rumor, I knew the conspiracy, but I thought that it was just a clever and witty marketing ploy pulled off by the Beatles, because that's how the Beatles are sold to us, right? They're very clever, they're very witty. And so I bought the book and I started reading it, and when I got into it, I thought to myself, this is unbelievable. The first thing that hit me is the amount of information in the book. So when you read it, the details and the information are so deep that this has to have been written by or sourced from somebody that is either within the inner circle and has knowledge of all of this information, or it was actually written by the person playing the part of Paul McCartney, which would be, I refer to him as Billy Shears. On the Sgt. Pepper album, the title track is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and then the second track is With a Little Help from My Friends. And in between the title track and With a Little Help from My Friends, he introduces himself, the one and only Billy Shears. And a lot of people think that's Ringo, because Ringo sings the song, but it's not. It was a way in which they were able to camouflage the clue. They gave Ringo the song to sing, but they were actually the Beatles and Billy himself, because Sgt. Pepper's his album, along with George Martin, their producer. He was introducing himself in that album. So that was the first album in which he came out publicly playing the part of Paul McCartney. So when I bought the book, I started reading it, trying to get my head wrapped around what I was reading and what it was telling me, because it's so diametrically opposed to the official narrative. It's a 180-degree difference. But I could have done one of two things. I could have just put the book down and say, this is just nonsense, and I'm not going to read any more of this. I have better things to do. Or let me take a closer look at what this book is saying, and let me start some research to see if I can either prove or disprove what the book is telling me. I decided to do the latter. And I was mentioning before we got started that I mentioned this to a friend of mine, Sophia Smallstorm. At the time, Sophia and I did a number of podcasts together. And I just mentioned to her that I got this book and I was telling her a little bit about it. And then she said, well, Mike, come on my podcast and talk about it. And I paused and I dragged my feet, Will, because the book is 666 pages.
Yeah, I remember you mentioning that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Provocative page number.
A very, very strange amount of pages. And maybe we can get into the occult aspect of this a little bit later.
Yes, please.
But I knew in order to do that, I would have to basically boil down 666 pages and organize it in a way that I would be able to take the audience through it in 2 hours without getting completely lost in the woods. I just basically just pushed it off and pushed it off. So finally, she convinced me to do it. And that was back in September of 2016. I think it was September 12th. And I didn't think I was going to do any more shows on it. I figured this is a one-shot deal. I read this book. I'll do a presentation on it. I'll share my thoughts. I'll tell you what's in the book. And then what happened was Mark Devlin contacted Sophia and asked her for my email because he wanted to talk to me about the book as well. So I told Mark, okay, I'll come on your show and talk about it as well. And it's really funny, and I'll wrap this up because I don't want to take up too much of your time giving this much background on how I got started. But I told Mark in that show toward the latter part of it, famous last words, I said, and this will be the last interview that I'll do on the Paul is Dead topic and the Beatles conspiracy. And I couldn't have been more wrong. It just...
Correct. Yes.
So that's the background. That's how I got involved in it. And one thing led to another. And I was, as I mentioned before we got started, I was doing the research and presenting it in stages because I didn't want to overwhelm the audience with so much information that was so contradictory to what they believed, because what would happen is they would just glaze over and you lose them.
Yeah.
So I had to break it down in bite-sized chunks, and I did that over the course of the 8 years.
So what's so funny is in that little short discussion of the background, how you got into this, you've already touched on so many different topics that I'm familiar with from having watched many hours of your work getting ready for this interview, but just how many pieces there are to this. Like, I don't know how many people today are aware that there was a rumor in the mid-60s that Paul McCartney had passed away. They're maybe not even aware of the two different kind of phases of the Beatles, where they had this sort of like pop rock band in the first half of the 60s and then the full-on psychedelic in the second half of the 60s, and that the Paul is dead, like the Paul's death may have come in between those two, the occult significance, all these different pieces. Like all of this is wrapped up in a story that's come down, you know, kind of through the ages as like these icons that changed music forever, the Beatles, you know, oh, right. But then all this was exposed to you just because you were browsing on Amazon and it suggested a book to you and you're like, I'll check that out. But then instead of like just kind of taking it for granted, like, oh, that's cool, and putting it on the shelf, you actually decided to dive in deeper and see what was really there. Like, do you remember the thought that was kind of going through your mind? Like, I kind of want to look into this. Like, what was happening in that particular moment that set you on this path?
Well, I was a total Beatle freak, Will.
Okay.
So I was really, really into the Beatles. In fact, I've mentioned this on a couple of interviews. Back in 1968, when I was 9 years old, I was born in 59. I bugged my father and my mother to take me to the movie theater to go see Yellow Submarine. That was released in 1968. And my brother, who's about 13, 14 months younger than I am, he was a little Beatle freak too. So the two of us, you know, and, so finally we convinced my dad to take us, and, you know, Dad sat there for 90 minutes in total anguish. And it was an animation, and I was only 9 years old, and I didn't realize that the movie was an animation. The actual Beatles themselves didn't come out until the last 5 or 10 minutes of the film. And so I was born and raised on the Beatles from a musical perspective. They're the reason why I started playing guitar. They're the reason why I started writing songs. Mm-hmm. And so when I read this, at first I thought, well, this can't possibly be true.
Wow.
Because we are so inundated with the official narrative, so conditioned. What I explain to people is, look, don't feel bad if you're having a hard time getting your head wrapped around this, because the brainwashing coming out of Tavistock and the Frankfurt School has been pounding us over the head for 60 years.
Yep.
That's a long time. That's 6 decades of conditioning and continuing to push the official narrative. So it becomes very difficult. And quite honestly, for so many people, especially boomers, it's the soundtrack of their life growing up.
Yeah.
And so to reach in and try to pull something like that out of your life, a lot of people are not going to allow it. They're not going to let go. They're going to say, nope, you stay away from me, you lunatic. You know? Yeah. So, you know, when I do the research, Will, I do the research mostly for me. It's for my own curiosity. Mm-hmm. It's my own personal path to seek the truth. I like presenting my research. Now, whether people agree with it or not, that's up to them. I've always said in many, many, many of my presentations and my interviews that I'm not here to convince anybody of anything. I'm just presenting my research. Mm-hmm. And it's up to you to be able to decide where you want to go with it. If you don't want to do anything with it, that's fine. If you want to pursue it, that's great as well, because everybody is on their own individual journey. So I found that a long time ago, Will, because I've been in the whole alternative research game for a long time. Trying to convince people of something when they're not ready is exhaustive.
Yep.
And it's basically an exercise in wheel spinning. Mm-hmm. So that's how I approach it. I'm just going to present what I found, my findings, my conclusions, and you can agree with it or not.
So when you read the book and you started getting into the memoirs of Billy Shears, Billy Shears is the real name of the man who replaced Paul McCartney when Paul McCartney died. So the memoirs of Billy Shears, if I understand it correctly, are this is 60, 50 years later, the man who replaced Paul McCartney, who we know in the public as Paul McCartney, is disclosing to the public in a coded, layered kind of way what actually went on 60 years ago. And so you're reading this in 2016 and you're just kind of like scratching your head, shaking your head, like, what's going on here? Where was the first place that you went? What was the first step that you took after reading this to begin doing your research?
Oh boy, that's a good question. The first thing that I did was to create a collage of images of Paul McCartney over time. Mm-hmm. What Tavistock did, and I'll explain, I'll get to the punchline first, and then we'll talk about the images.
Yes.
What Tavistock did was to create a composite Paul McCartney. So on any given magazine cover, any given interview, images that you're going to find in newspapers or even online, it's a moment in time. You're taking a look at that person and you're being told that's Paul McCartney. And the vast majority of the population are going to look at that and not question it. They're going to say, well, if it's not Paul McCartney, who else is it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? They just accept the fact that it's Paul McCartney. It's like when you look at the Sgt. Pepper album cover. That's the first album cover in which we see Billy. That doesn't look like Paul McCartney. And a lot of people who subscribe to my channel will say when they first looked at that album, they were like, something's really off about Paul McCartney.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't look like him. But you're told that that is Paul McCartney. So even though you're looking at the album cover and you're kind of scratching your head, you're thinking, well, okay, it doesn't really look like him, but who else would it be? So, okay, it's Paul McCartney. That's what Tavistock did. So they created a composite of him. Now, to get around this composite, what you have to do is what I did. Go back to the collage or go back to a montage of pictures and start like in 1962, go through 63, 64, 65, all the way through. Let's just say through the 1970s into the 80s. But let's just pick the Beatle period, 62 through 1970. When you line the pictures up, you can see that it's not the same person, that the person playing Paul McCartney between 1962 and 66 is not the same person that's playing the part of Paul McCartney from 1967 to 1970. There are differences. Some people will write me this. It's very common for people to say, you mean that they found somebody that looks like him, sounds like him, sings like him, plays like him. My response is look closely because they are not exact replicas. Mm-hmm. Billy has a higher forehead. Billy has different ears. Billy has a longer jawline. And as I mentioned before we got started, and I'll talk about this a little bit, one of my colleagues, Sally Whitty, she is also blind. She's blind in her left eye. Mm-hmm. About a year and a half, 2 years ago, she figured out that Billy is blind in his right eye. So he only has sight in his left eye, whereas Paul McCartney had two good eyes. And Sally presented, and as well as myself, presented the evidence to show that he is indeed blind in his right eye. And like I said, Sally's a very, very good researcher. She's exceptional. And being blind herself, she was able to pick up on the telltale signs when somebody has an ocular prosthetic. Mm-hmm. And Billy validated this in an interview. There was this exhibit that was out, I guess, several months ago, called Eyes of the Storm. And yes, right.
Yeah.
So he's on a morning show, I think it was CBS, and he's going through the exhibit and the person's interviewing him. And so they get to this one picture, they're looking at it on the wall. And so the interviewer says to Billy, that's quite a picture. You have to have an eye to take a picture like that. So Billy looks at the picture, he leans forward, clicks his left heel, and says, yeah, my left one. So there's a process in Masonry that's referred to as masterfully speaking. Mm-hmm. So when a Mason masterfully speaks, they can actually relay the truth, but they do it in an encoded way. And most people don't know anything about masterfully speaking, and they don't really know what it is that they're hearing or looking for. And so it goes right over their heads. And so that's what Billy did during that exhibit. And he, when he said that, yes, it's my left one, he was giving a nod to Sally's research that, yeah, you figured it out. I don't have sight in my left eye. It's just my right eye. And I had a very similar situation. We'll get to it when we get to the music, where he masterfully spoke about their ability to write all their own music and record and play on all of their own tracks. But we'll get to that when the time is right.
Perfect. Well, you actually touched on a couple different things, but just real quick, one of the reasons I find this so interesting is I came to Christ in 2020. Prior to that, I studied Western occultism for 2 years. So I'm aware of occult teachings. Like that was just something that was part of my life. And so all this stuff is very real and it's very much out there. I was also in the dance and DJ world. I was an underground house music DJ for 15 years. Right. And so for me, it was very interesting to look at what the world that I was a part of, which is entirely a Pied Piper world. Right. And I got delivered from that. it traced its lineage all the way back to the 1960s. That's where the techno world essentially got its ideology from. And I worked in the music industry as well. I worked in a professional music studio, helping out engineers for a couple of years. So I'm reading and I'm listening to your presentations, and all of this stuff is like clicking into place from my own life experience, which is one of the reasons why it's been so fun to watch your videos. So you mentioned a couple different things. You mentioned Tavistock. So let's unpack who they are and how they play into the picture, the Tavistock Institute, and then we can start talking about the songwriting, because I think that'll play in quite nicely.
To get started with Tavistock, to understand especially the deep state in general, this book by John Coleman, The Committee of 300, The Conspirators' Hierarchy. It was this book, based upon a clue dropped in Memoirs, that led me actually to this book, where in The Committee of 300, Coleman explains that the Beatles were a creation of Tavistock. Now, the book is not about the Beatles. The book is about the Committee of 300 and the deep state structure, which Tavistock is part of. So that was a piece, too, that I had to investigate. Another book that I recommend people read is The Tavistock Institute by Daniel Estulin, Social Engineering the Masses. Mm-hmm. Another Coleman book, Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, Shaping the Moral, Spiritual, Cultural, Political, and Economic Decline of the United States of America.
It's called Tavistock Institute by Coleman?
Dr. John Coleman.
Okay, great. I'll make a note of that. All this will be in the show notes for the audience.
Now, the reason why I bring the books up is because there is no possible way that I can explain every nuance about Tavistock with the Frankfurt School in an interview. It takes a lot of research, a lot of reading these types of books and taking a deep dive. But Tavistock is an internationalist organization that's responsible for implementing change, societal change, behavior modification via brainwashing. They were founded in 1921 as the Tavistock Clinic. They originated from Wellington House. Now, Wellington House was the World War I propaganda arm of the British military against the war with Germany. From Wellington House, that segued into the Tavistock Clinic in 1921. Mm-hmm. It was also known as the Freudian Hilton due to Sigmund Freud's daughter, Dr. Anna Freud, becoming a leading figure. So Tavistock is very much linked into Freudian philosophy, as is the Frankfurt School, by the way. It reports up through the Committee of 300. Again, you can refer to Dr. Coleman's book, The Conspirators' Hierarchy. It collaborates with other internationalist think tanks and theoreticians, in other words, the Fabian Society, the Frankfurt School, the World Economic Forum, the Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group. All of these organizations are all tied into. They're all part of the deep state control system. And Tavistock is the mind control social engineering headquarters for the deep state. They were taken over in 1932 by Dr. John Rawling Rees. He was a key figure in British Army intelligence, and during World War II, Rees was a brigadier general, and he was a top psychiatric warfare specialist for the British. And so he takes the helm at Tavistock in 1932. They have far-reaching influence throughout governments, NGOs, the private business sector, meaning corporations, public and private institutions, mass media, global think tanks, the military, education, the music and entertainment industry, etc. You mentioned occultism. Occultism is integrated within Tavistock's psychological approaches to manipulate and transform thinking. And Daniel Estulin gets into a bit of the occult aspect within Tavistock in his book. Tavistock became the psychological warfare arm of the British military and intelligence services. So before it was Wellington House, and then it migrated over, and it's still doing psychological warfare for the British. In 1946, Tavistock was upgraded to make it the central laboratory for developing hardcore brainwashing techniques. So at this point, what happened was, through people like Edward Bernays, who was tied into Tavistock, they moved it from let's just say a Europe-centric focus, and then during World War II and post-World War II, they set their sights on the United States. Because in order to bring about a world government, they had to conquer America. They had to break down the American way of life, the traditional values. They had a specific target on Christianity. We could talk about that in a bit. Mm-hmm. So it was a systematic approach to take the United States and subvert it from within and collapse it. And for anybody who's doubting that, just take a look around you today. What's going on? Okay.
Right.
I mean, this is the result of the Frankfurt School in Tavistock. These are their principles. These are their strategies that are being played out, and they are very, very good at what they do. And I'm talking about Tavistock. We can argue that the Frankfurt School doesn't exist anymore, but its philosophy, its ideology lives on. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very prominent in everything that's going on in the world today. Going back to 1946, the Rockefellers dumped a bunch of money into Tavistock to do its social engineering. In 1948, Rees became president of the UN-linked World Federation of Mental Health. And the UN became a major conduit for British psychological warfare operations. So that's another thing that's important to understand, that this whole deep state, this whole shadow government is tightly linked. And these players span multiple functions. So we just can't look at it as they're all living in silos. Think of it as a horizontal, and they're all integrated. It's the world's center for mass mind manipulation and social engineering activities. It's a sophisticated organization that's used to shape the destiny of the world by changing the paradigms of modern society. It has control mechanisms in academia, multimedia, intelligence, medicine, the pharmaceutical industry. Mm-hmm. Its range of disciplines include anthropology, economics, organizational behavior, political science, psychoanalysis, psychology, and sociology. So that's a quick rundown on Tavistock. And it's a very important organization to dig into and research if you really want to understand what's going on in the world, why things are working or not working the way they do. They're behind it.
Mm-hmm. So how do they connect to the Beatles? Like what role, because you mentioned the Coleman book and the conspirators hierarchy, Community of 300. Yeah. What does he say the role that the Beatles played in connection with Tavistock?
Tavistock, as part of its social engineering, they knew that music plays a very, very important role in shaping people's behavior, shaping their morals, their beliefs. And a lot of that came into Tavistock from the Frankfurt School. Mm-hmm. The Frankfurt School was out of Germany, and it came into being at about the exact same time as Tavistock. The Frankfurt School was very active in the 1920s and the 1930s, but it lived on past that. Like the individual members that were part of the Frankfurt School were still doing their social engineering and their behavior modification beyond that period of time. It's important to understand the Frankfurt School as well. It's very important because
yes, it is.
They are connected at the hip with Tavistock. So it formed in 1923 by a person by the name of George Lukács. Mm-hmm. Now, George Lukács was a communist Bolshevik and was very prominent in the field of communism back in his day. And so what he did was he brought together a group of intellectuals, Bolshevik and communist intellectuals and intelligentsia, to start to think through how they were going to destroy Western civilization in order to bring about a one-world government. This one-world government is going to be a socialist, communist, pick your word. It's going to be controlling, okay? Mm-hmm. Sometimes people want to argue with socialism, communism, fascism. At the end of the day, it's going to be controlled. So Lukács was quoted as saying, "Who will save us from Western civilization?" And one of their key components was to undermine Christianity through an abolition of culture, to destroy the culture. So if you destroy the culture, then we're going to be able to take out Christianity. We're going to be able to take out traditional values. And part of the destruction of traditional values was to destroy the traditional family, the family nucleus. That was very, very key. And to marginalize the male or the father figure in a family. This is why you have cartoons that came out like Homer Simpson, where he's depicted as adult. Well, that's all intentional. So the Frankfurt School was comprised of communists, fascists, Zionists, Freudians, and anti-Christian zealots. They were philosophers, socialists, and psychiatrists dedicated to destroying Western civilization. They were co-sponsored directly by British intelligence. One of the things when you do the research, you're going to find that all of this stuff still goes back to the British because it goes back to the Rothschild dynasty. Sigmund Freud is a key figure with the Frankfurt School as well as Tavistock, and Sigmund Freud is considered the father of psychoanalysis. Now, the interesting thing about psychoanalysis is that Freud had said that psychoanalysis is like a religion. You can't prove it, but you accept it on faith.
Mm-hmm.
So even they admit that their psychiatry and their psychoanalysis doesn't really have any basis of science behind it. But they're going to put it forth as if it's scientific fact. And they're going to sell it to the masses. So psychoanalysis cannot clinically prove that any important Freudian concept really exists. So another very good document on the Frankfurt School comes from the Schiller Institute. They have some great research and articles. And the other one is from the Schiller Institute, From Cybernetics to Littleton Techniques in Mind Control. They talk about the Frankfurt School and Tavistock as well. So some of the information I have here, I actually culled from those articles. So during World War II, I explained before that Tavistock set its sights on the United States starting around 1946, during the war and then right after the war. And the purpose of that was to start the affront on the American way of life and to tear it down. Well, interestingly enough, the Frankfurt School was shipped over to the United States during World War II as well. Some of their storefronts were Columbia University, Hollywood, of course, and government. In fact, one of their members, a very prominent member, was Herbert Marcuse.
Mm-hmm.
And Herbert wound up working for the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. So many of them made their way into very prominent positions within the United States government and U.S. government agencies and organizations. They were responsible also for putting forth the premise that man is not made in the image of God. This was a big thing with the Frankfurt School. They really preached godlessness. They wanted to strip away the belief that, for example, art is derived from the self-conscious emulation of God, the creator. So in other words, that when you create art, when you create something, that's something that is inherent in you as a divine creation of God. That creativity, that creative process.
Mm-hmm.
They put forth the premise of the theory that creativity does not emanate from a divine spark. It springs out of the culture. In other words, your creativity is not something that's come from God. It comes from the culture because you exist in the culture. So what you're really doing is you're aggregating the environment around you and you're bringing that in and you're expressing that.
Wow.
They were very, very focused on, at least some of them, on being liberated through erotica, through sex. So as we go into the Beat movement really were an extension of the Frankfurt School in Tavistock. And the Beats, they declared themselves as hedonists.
Mm-hmm. Kerouac.
Yes, Kerouac, Ginsberg, and William S. Burroughs, who, by the way, is on the cover of the Sgt. Pepper album.
Along with Aleister Crowley.
That's right. They also said that an artist does not consciously create work to uplift society, but unconsciously transmits the ideological assumptions of the culture. So again, I'm not writing songs because I want to uplift society. And that's not coming to me because I have a divine connection spark with God, the creator and source. No, it's only because you're operating in a certain environment, and that environment is what's feeding you. They're downplaying the entire piece that has to do with your divine connection. And they're relegating it down to a material, physical world, and that's where it all exists.
Well, we can see this today when they talk about classic literature like William Shakespeare and stuff like that. They say, oh, Shakespeare was just a product of his time. He's just regurgitating the values of his, and pick any number of artists. Not that there was anything transcendent going on. Oh, he was just embedded in the culture, and that's what he was reflecting.
One of the things that they will preach is that entertainment replaced art. When we talk about art was something that it was special. You would look at a creative piece, and it wasn't something that was really in your daily life. It was something maybe you had to make a special trip to go see the art. You had to make plans to be able to have an appreciation of what it is that you were going to see. But what they did was they relegated the great art. They watered it down by taking entertainment and propping it up. So what happened was the whole art piece gets relegated to a shelf somewhere, and now people view art as entertainment, and entertainment is art. And that's a whole dumbing down effect, because if we take a look at what's being pumped into our living rooms from an entertainment perspective, or the movie screens or Netflix or whatever, that's nothing more than trash that's being pumped out and being assimilated in, it's being taken in by the person who doesn't know any better, and they're being indoctrinated. They're being brainwashed to accept this stuff. I hope I'm making sense here.
Yeah.
Art used to be here, and entertainment was down here. And then what they did, they pushed the art down, and they raised the entertainment piece up, and this has created a dumbing down effect, which is absolutely incredible. They invented political correctness, which they ensured permeated the entire education system. And a very interesting piece here that was in the Schiller Institute is the radio project from 1937. This is something that Theodor Adorno was heavily involved in. Adorno was with the Frankfurt School, and I believe he was heavily involved with the whole Beatles project as well. The radio project was a Frankfurt School initiative that was to test the thesis that mass media can brainwash the masses. And one of the things they point to was Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, where it was pumped out to 6 million people. And many people believed that it was real, even though there were times during the broadcast where they said that this was not real. But people didn't hear that piece of it. And that also taught them something. That also taught them that people heard what they wanted to hear versus what it is that they were told. So they were told this was not real, but people blew past that and got all caught up. In fact, in the paper, it said that many people didn't maybe think it was aliens, but they thought it was the Germans that had invaded the United States. These social scientists at Tavistock and the Frankfurt School and other organizations like the CIA, because the CIA, by the way, that's one of Tavistock's clients, is the CIA. This is spelled out in John Coleman's book. What's happening is they're learning from this. Mm-hmm. And this goes to a concept called cybernetics. So cybernetics has to do with where you have input and output, right? So it's a cycle. So this is how AI works as well. So AI is a concept that has been established based upon cybernetics. So you have inputs, and then when you input something, you have an output. That output then gets rewired back in as an input. So you have this cycle going. It's learning. So when we talk about machine learning, when we talk about artificial intelligence learning, this is what's going on. So back in the day, of course, they didn't have AI, didn't have computers and everything else. So their way of being able to do this loop of learning, cybernetics, was to do these types of tests. And they would make note of what the outcome was, and then they would input it back in, and they would make adjustments to the model or the algorithm or the strategy until they got closer and closer to what it is that they wanted as an end result. This is why polling is one of those concepts as well. Polls, they're really there to measure how effective their conditioning and brainwashing is. So when a poll comes out a certain way, and it's not exactly how they want that poll to appear, then they're going to step back and say, okay, let's go back to the drawing board. Let's make a couple of adjustments, and let's see if we can get it to move more over here where we want it. So that's another tactic that they used, was polling, and they established a whole concept of public opinion polling. It was really used to pulse the public and to feed the conditioning and social engineering engine. That's what polling was, and still is. That's what it's used for. They also had something called the authoritarian personality, and this is really kind of interesting. But the authoritarian personality by the Frankfurt School is defined as somebody basically who's a critical thinker and can assess things based upon using their God-given gift of intellect and reason. That person was authoritative because that person would then say, well, I think certain things would work better this way or that way, or we should change this and change that. Maybe we should do this or do that, versus the hive mind.
Oh, wow.
So it's kind of interesting the way they worded that. So when we think about the authoritative personality, when I first was going through this and researching it, I was thinking, well, I'm thinking in terms of an authoritative figure. Now, if you were a critical thinker, you were problematic because you were cutting across the grain and you were not going with the flow and you were not in the hive mind. So you would be considered to be a problem.
You are putting together so many pieces for me right now, because I've heard of the authoritarian personality, and like you, I always thought it referred to like a dictator.
Yeah, right.
But the authoritarian personality as being an individual who makes critical distinctions between things, that's considered authoritarian. In fact, I'm dealing with this on Twitter right now because the celebrity Russell Brand, maybe perhaps you know him, he's recently been making a big show about becoming Christian, and he said a few things that I've been challenging him on, And so I have a lot of people supporting me, but I have a lot of people that are getting very, very angry, that are sort of, they're not saying in so many words that I'm behaving in this authoritarian personality way, but they kind of are. That I'm trying to make fine distinctions. They're reacting to the things that I'm saying, trying to be discerning about who this man is. Yeah. And so I was wondering where that was coming from, and I understand that. And it also helps me understand the get woke, go broke phenomenon of like Star Wars. So if you're raised, if you're tutored and taught in a Frankfurt School mindset that teaches you're only producing materials that are relevant to this cultural moment, and that's your only way of thinking of creativity, then you're just going to regurgitate stuff that speaks to whatever cultural zeitgeist is going on and not believe that this responsibility that you've been given to create is a gift, is a chance to channel the divine spark. So naturally, like, people are trying to understand how are these people producing these garbage Star Wars, Star Trek shows, or Lord of the Rings, or whatever, name it. How are they putting out trash with a straight face? Well, because they don't actually believe that they have a divine spark of creativity. All they know how to do is regurgitate what's in their environment. So they're doing what their program. So all of these pieces, I've never looked into the Tavistock Institute. I mean, I'm familiar with who they are. I'm familiar with the Frankfurt School. I'm familiar with Marcuse and Adorno and all of that. But I didn't understand that it goes back this far. That's the important thing, is that we're used to thinking of the 60s as being the big debut of social engineering, right? Those of us, who are looking into these things, it was going on a long time before that.
Modern day social engineering with social scientists has been going on for a century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If we go back to Wellington House, and when Wellington House then morphed into the Tavistock Clinic in 1921, I think I said, the early 1920s, and we're in 2024, that's 100 years.
Yeah.
So they've had 100 years of really fine-tuning how they go about their business. Now, just to finish up on the Frankfurt School, Will, I don't want to take up too much time here. When you listen to the Frankfurt School and you listen to Marcuse and Adorno, and when you read that stuff, they're very, very slick, and they're very nuanced in how they go about presenting their message and their theories. They're very, very good at it, and they're very convincing. So it'll come across as altruistic, it's egalitarian, but when you take a step back, it's gaslighting. Because if everything they were talking about was good, then we wouldn't be in the predicament we're in today.
That's right.
Here's another very interesting quote, and this comes from Bertrand Russell, who was a British elitist. He was a philosopher, mathematician, but I think he was with the Fabian Society, which means he was big time into eugenics, and he was connected into the Frankfurt School as well. He's quoted as saying that the objective is to produce an unshakable conviction that snow is black. So this is how they were thinking. And then he went on to say that, and then we have to assess how much cheaper it would be, how much more cost effective it would be to convince people that snow is gray. So the point being is, like, if we take a look at today, right, and what's going on today, we're told that there are more than two genders.
Mm-hmm.
If we just go down that path for a moment, then we're told that men can have babies or they can breastfeed and stuff like that. That is trying to produce the unshakable conviction that snow is black.
Mm-hmm.
It makes no sense. It defies thinking. It defies real science. Yet there are people that will run with this and believe it. So that type of thinking, this is all the result of decades of Frankfurt School and Tavistock indoctrination and strategies to social engineer and to create behavior modification. The Frankfurt School had this thing called critical theory, and Adorno was big into this, that divides the masses into two categories. And I'm just smiling so you know, right?
Oh, yeah.
There were oppressors and victims. And the intent was to destabilize society and to destroy the, quote, oppressive order. So, and again, they were very nuanced and very good at explaining who the oppressors were. And they may not have necessarily been oppressors, but they were going to convince you that you were being oppressed. The example I use is with traditional family values, the mom would be home and she would care for the children and the home, and the father would go out. It was his responsibility to work and to provide and keep a roof over his family's head. And so what feminism and the women's movement, what Tavistock and the Frankfurt School did was to go about inundating through the media, because the media is their big stick. Going out and asking women, do you really want to be home? Do you really want to take care of kids? Don't you want to go do what your husband's doing? Don't you want to go to work? Don't you want to do this? Don't you want to do that? The truth of the matter is many women, I believe it's actually built into our DNA as men and women to have certain responsibilities, functions, and ways of living our lives, right?
I agree.
So a woman would say, you know what? My job, it's very important for me to stay home and to watch the children and to nurture them and care for them. And my husband does the work, and we work together as a husband and wife team, and we make the household work. But what they did was to convince women that you don't really want to do that. You really don't. So they were gaslighting them through steady streams of propaganda. They just kept beating the drum and beating the drum and beating the drum. And eventually what happened was, take a look at what happened, folks. Most women, a lot of women, left the household. They went to work. The husband went to work. The children now don't have the FaceTime or the interaction with their biological parents anymore, so they have to go to preschool. They're in school, after school. And the parents' interaction with their children happens in the evening when they both come home from work, or it's on the weekends when it's just a flurry of activity, because if you're working 5 days a week, when you get to the weekend, it's not just about the kids. You have to attend to the household as well. So the children then are separated from their parents. They essentially become wards of the state. They are now being taught and nurtured by people outside of the family. And this is exactly what they wanted. Now, the other thing that the controllers did, they had other levers to make sure that they were able to push us along. As an example, they would increase the cost of living. So whereas, back in the 1950s, as an example, when my parents, I was born in 59, even going into the 1960s, you can have one parent working and the other parent staying home, and you can make things work. I would say we were, a blue-collar middle class on Long Island. My father was a policeman. Mom stayed home. But you know what? We did okay. But when they started raising the prices of everything and making it more costly to live your life, that forced a lot of the women out because they couldn't pay the bills unless they had two incomes. So I'm just bringing that up to say, because I don't want people to think that there's a single lever. They have lots of buttons and lots of levers that they push to manipulate society in order to push people in directions that they want to push them. Critical theory dissects existing societal beliefs and criticizes them in a way to redefine existing beliefs, values and morals and stuff like that, which they will tell you that the oppressors are your governments, they're your religions, and these entities, they inhibit human potential. So this goes back to the human potential movement of the 1960s that was spearheaded by Willis Harman under the umbrella of the Aquarian conspiracy.
Yeah, you can see all the pieces beginning to fit together of how did we get in this mess and how far back it goes.
Oh, it goes way back. So here, the Frankfurt School recommended the creation of racial divides, continual change to create confusion, teaching sex and alternative sexual lifestyles to children, undermining the authority of schools and teachers, promoting excessive drinking and drugs, emptying churches, creating an unreliable legal system. We see that in spades, creating dependency on the state, ensuring that they control the media, and to encourage the breakdown of the family. I talked about their strategy to marginalize the role of the father and to remove the parents as the primary educators and to obfuscate the difference between genders. This is something that comes out of their playbook. And again, like I said, they're connected at the hip with Tavistock, so they're very difficult to separate because these groups work together. One person in particular was Kurt Llewellyn. He bounced back and forth between Tavistock and the Frankfurt School, and he was a big-time social scientist back in the day. Bertrand Russell, our friend Bertrand Russell, who was, again, really an adjunct to the Frankfurt School, but he's was a big-time elitist. He's out of Britain. He's passed away now. He's been gone about 50 years. The use of music to promote mental illness and destroy society. Verses or lyrics set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective to brainwash people. So that's where the music industry and the entertainment industry, Hollywood, come into play. I think it was Adorno that said that they could promote a culture of pessimism and despair via the radio and television. So again, they could just pump this stuff into your living rooms. Now think about that, folks. Every time you turn on your TV set, does any good news ever come out of the speaker? No. It's always tragedy. It's always some kind of shooting. It's always something bad. It's war. Something bad is always being pumped into your living room. And that is what you're being inundated with. I'm a retired hypnotherapist.
Oh.
And so I'm very, very familiar with hypnotherapy and the television set. The subconscious mind loves imagery.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why when you watch television, there'll be loops being played, looped imagery. Like if we pick 9/11 with the plane hitting the building, they kept playing it over and over and over again. The reason why they were doing that was because that was conditioning. That was mind control. Then what they did was they added the post-hypnotic suggestions to the imagery by continuing to talk about the tragedy, to talk about war, to talk about death. So you were associating these images now with very negative terms and words. This is how they do it. The television is a hypnosis box.
Yep.
All right, my friend. So just keep that in mind. To finish up the Frankfurt School, its network extends into eugenics, population control, sexual and family law reforms, changing it for the worse. It is linked to publishing houses, all your books, medical, educational, and research establishments, women's organizations, marriage counseling, governments, etc. And I talked about cybernetics and the whole study of the circular process of input and output and receiving feedback and then fine-tuning whatever it is that you're working on from a cybernetic perspective. So that's the Frankfurt School. So and the reason why I took everybody through that in Tavistock, not just because Will asked me, is because now you can have a better understanding when we talk about the music industry. You can start to get your head wrapped around the Beatles. And not just the Beatles. I mean, we're talking about the Rolling Stones. We're talking about the entire British invasion. Think about how they coined that term, the British invasion. I mentioned before that this all goes back to Britain. Tavistock, British. So it was the British invasion. So another way of saying it is the Tavistock invasion to begin the process of systematically changing the construct, the societal and cultural construct within the United States and also over in England as well and the rest of the world. Did you want me to get into the Beatles?
I think that would probably be a good time. I mean, I think where I connect with all this is spending a lot of time in the New Age and having unplugged all of that. I don't know that I haven't read the book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, but in one of your videos you were talking about it. I'm like, yeah, that was basically my whole life for 20 years. So that was sort of my doorway into this stuff. And I kept finding that no matter where I walked in this kind of New Age world, I would always end up in front of the Beatles. Right? All roads in some sense lead to them. So naturally, when I started watching your work and you started pulling on those threads, that's when everything started to unravel and open the door so much more. So I think now would be a really great time to get to them.
Tavistock clearly understood, as well as Bertrand Russell and the Frankfurt School, that music played a very, very important role in conditioning people to formulate belief systems. There's an old saying, your thoughts are not your own.
Yeah.
It's so true. Think about where you receive your information from and question it. Question everything. Because we've gotten to the point today where it's just one gigantic propaganda and indoctrination machine around us 24/7, every single day. When I looked at the Beatles, initially, it focused on the replacement of Paul McCartney. And so I took you through that. I looked at the images and pulled the evidence together. And trust me, folks, the guy that's playing Paul McCartney today is not biological Paul McCartney. He's not the guy that you remember back from the early 1960s. He is not. I know people are going to disagree with me, and do me a favor. Just go to my YouTube channel. Lots of content on that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to convince people of that. Just take a look at it.
Do you have one video that I can send people to in particular that's about that one issue?
Yeah, I actually did a video. What I'll do, Will, is I can send it to you after the show. I have a link, The Beatles Conspiracy 101.
Okay.
On my YouTube channel. And it's only a 1 minute short. But what it does is it refers you to the description box to specific shows which will help you to understand the flow of this Beatles conspiracy.
Great.
So you start here with replacing Paul McCartney, and then we make our way into the music piece of it.
Excellent.
Did they write all their own music and play on all the recorded tracks? The answer is no, they did not, but I'll talk about that. So knowing what we know now about the Frankfurt School in Tavistock, they had to put a musical phenomena in place. They had to kick off something that was going to take the world by storm. There are pictures on the internet of Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and John Lennon with bird cages. With George Harrison and Paul McCartney, the bird cages are on their heads. With John Lennon, he's leaning up next to a birdcage with a Superman shirt, which goes back to Nietzsche and the Übermensch, the superhuman, the Superman. This is a concept of the elites. If we listen to the World Economic Forum and we listen to Yuval Harari talking about that they have achieved godlike status now. When they talk about this stuff today, it all has history. But you have to know where it goes back to. Otherwise, it just sounds like kookiness. It might still sound like kookiness, but at least you could tie it back to an ideology that these people are in love with. So going back to the birdcage, so birdcage symbolism refers to mind control, MK slaves. And so when I took a look at those pictures, and there are a lot of images of the Beatles engaged in occult symbolism. Now, some people are going to want to argue that because they were so young that they really didn't have an idea what they were doing. They were just doing what they were told to do. And that could very well be true. But the point being is, even though they may have been doing what they were told to do without any real knowledge of what it meant, the occult was still being communicated out symbolically to not only their inner circle, but also as a way of poking what they refer to us as the profane in the eye. Since we don't really understand what it means, we're going to put it right out in front of you. It's a way of them poking fun at the fact that the masses are unknowing. So the Beatles arrive in Hamburg in August of 1960. And in August of 1960, they did not have very good musician skills, and they showed absolutely no songwriting prowess.
How old were they as well? How old were John, Ringo, or
in 1960, Paul would have been 18. John would have been 20. George was underage. He was 17. That was a problem when he was out there because he was underage. Eventually, they worked around that. Ringo wasn't with them yet. It was Pete Best in the Hamburg days. Ringo didn't show up until 1962 when it was announced in a Mersey Beat publication in August, September of 1962 that Pete was out and Ringo was in. So the Beatles show up in August of 1960, and they're brought there by their then manager, Alan Williams. They were not very good. If you listen to the Beatles themselves, especially Billy, when he talks about the Beatle period going back to Hamburg, he will say that they weren't very good musicians, and they're very rudimentary at best. In fact, there's an interview with Alan Williams from the Beatle documentary, The Complete Beatles, which goes back to the 1980s, which was the definitive documentary about the Beatles until Anthology was released in the 1990s, where he says he was told by one of the clubs in Germany, don't bring that bum group, the Beatles, to Hamburg. We have a good thing going here. Don't bring that bum group, the Beatles, here. There's a big, huge German connection to all of this stuff, and we'll talk about that a bit. So what happens is, the Beatles get to Hamburg, and they're playing at these clubs, and they're playing 7 hours a night. They're living in squalor. They were hanging out in an old cinema. They were using that as basically their shelter. In an interview that Pete Best did years ago, he was being interviewed, and he said the way it worked in Hamburg was they would play in these clubs 7 hours a night. They would go back to wherever they were hanging out, and they would get up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And they had to be back at the club, at the venue, at 6 o'clock. So they had a 3-hour window of time between the time they woke up and they had to be back at the club. So there was no songwriting taking place there. All right, they were just probably getting through their hangover and making their way. And, Hamburg was a red light district, lots of alcohol. And so the Beatles have their stint in Hamburg, and they return home in December of 1960 completely dejected because absolutely nothing transpired. The reason why they were doing Hamburg and they were doing all these gigs is because Tavistock needed to improve and enhance their performance skills for when they were going to take the Beatlemania show out live starting in late 1963 and going into early 1964 in the U.S. So think of Hamburg and all the gigs they were doing back in Liverpool and the UK as boot camp. If you go on Wikipedia and you take a look at the Beatles' live performances, you will see that they were playing virtually every single day from 1961 through 1963. They had a couple of days off here and there, but they had a gig every single day. And in Hamburg, they were there for weeks. They might be there 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time, and they were playing virtually every night. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, and this question was actually pointed out by a friend of mine, Peter Tompkins, on Pete's YouTube channel, PT Pop. He interviewed me and I interviewed Pete. And Pete's a musician too. He goes, Mike, how are they getting all these gigs?
Mm-hmm.
So 61, they start getting all of these gigs and they're playing and then they meet Brian Epstein in, I think it was November 9th of 1961. So he goes to see them at the Cavern Club. Again, remember the time frame. August 1960 to December of 1960, nothing happens. Then January of 1961 up through November of 1961, they're doing all these gigs and they just happen to meet up with Brian Epstein, who went to go see them at the Cavern Club. And he says, he loved them and he wanted to sign them to a contract. During this period of time, the Beatles are doing nothing but cover tunes. They're not doing original music. They are a bar and club band that does cover music.
Yep.
Then, on January 1st of 1962, they wind up at Decca Records to do a demo. 15 songs, 12 covers, and 3 nondescript originals. And these 3 originals never made their way onto any of their albums that they released as a unit. I think maybe 1 or 2 of the songs are represented on the anthology release, which came out in the 1990s. So now we have to ask ourselves, okay, so hold on a second here. So August of 1960, they're in Hamburg. Nothing happens. And then from January 1st through, let's say, December 31st of 1961, they're doing all these gigs. They meet up with Epstein. Epstein meets up with them. Then they get a demo with Decca Records, a major label. Who even knows who they are?
Right.
So Decca turns them down. Decca says, no, not interested. So then Brian Epstein takes tapes to George Martin a month later, and he plays the tapes for George Martin, and George Martin says, well, if you're asking me to judge them by what you're showing me here, I'm not interested.
He said that. George Martin says that in your videos. There's a direct quote of his coming from his lips where he says exactly those words.
There's another story with Norman Smith, who was their engineer from Please Please Me, the first Parlophone UK release. And by the way, their Parlophone albums are their official albums, not the US Capitol releases. And he was with them through Rubber Soul. In 1971, in a magazine called New Music Express, he said they were terrible in the studio, that they failed in the studio, and he was not impressed by them at all. So you get these stories, and you have to say to yourself, okay, let's set aside all the feel-good, happy talk stories, and let's understand why these things were said. Is it revelation of the method? Are they putting the truth out there so that they could say, well, I told you the truth, but you just decided that you didn't want to hear it?
Right.
So George turns them down, and then they sign a contract with EMI 5 months later in June of 1962.
Right.
So the question becomes, well, what changed between February and June of 1962?
They're a bum group that no one likes, and then suddenly they get signed.
Right. And George Martin had said that they had nothing behind them, and the best song he could find from them was Love Me Do. That's even if they wrote that song. And that's interesting because going back to the documentary I mentioned earlier, Will, The Complete Beatles, the 1980s documentary, in that documentary it says that between 1956 and 1962, Paul McCartney and John Lennon, either individually or together, wrote 100 songs, either individually or together, although they weren't recorded. That's very convenient. Okay, fine, they didn't record them. Okay, but let's just set that aside and say, okay, you told us that they wrote 100 songs. So when they get to George Martin, how could he say that they had nothing behind them and the best song he could find from them is Love Me Do, and he knew it was not the big hit he was looking for?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, in an interview that I think that it was from the documentary produced by George Martin, he's having a discussion with his son Giles, who actually George passed the baton to as far as the entire Beatle enterprise that George Martin was involved in. His son Giles is now, he has all of that. He says, I liked them. They had great personalities, but I thought their music was rubbish.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of stuff out there. I have another interview where George Martin says that it wasn't obvious that they were songwriters. Now, for those of you who are Beatle fans right now and you want to break your monitor because of the things I'm saying, just go watch the presentations and you can listen to George Martin say this himself. Quincy Jones said that Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr were no-playing
MFers, yeah.
MFers going back, and that was an article in Spin magazine. People said, oh, he retracted that. He never retracted that. What he apologized for was airing it out.
Yeah.
So we have these types of things going on. So we have the Norman Smith article, we have George Martin, you have Quincy Jones talking about all this. So then they get signed. Again, they don't have anything behind them, but yet they signed in June of 1962 and they released their first album, Please Please Me, 9 months later with 8 original Lennon and McCartney songs, 6 covers, 8 originals. So they went from 0 to hero in 9 months, signing with EMI. Some people would say, well, how come he signed them? I believe he was told that he had to sign them. It came from above him. So he worked for a guy, Oscar Prius. He worked for Glenn Wood. Oscar Prius had George's position with Parlophone before Oscar retired. Now, George took over the Parlophone label. I think he was 29 years old in 1955. So this tells you he was a mover and a shaker. They were moving George Martin along for EMI to give him his own label to manage, the Parlophone label. That's very impressive. The CEO of EMI at the time was Joseph Lockwood, Sir Joseph Lockwood. So I think what happened was that maybe perhaps George was not completely on board with what they were going to become. So in February he says no, and then later on he receives a phone call. This is actually explained in memoirs. He received a phone call from upstairs that said, you got to take him on. And when he first took him on, here's another thing. He didn't work with him directly. He delegated it to one of his assistants, Ron Richards, who later on spent a lot of years working with the Hollies. Ron takes the Beatles into the studio to see what he can get out of them. They did some recordings. The way the story goes, the playback is shown to George Martin and to Brian Epstein. And that resulted in a second phone call to George Martin. You can't delegate this. You have to work with them directly. You have to do your magic to make this work, George. So 9 months after they get signed, they come out with an album. They magically come up with 8 original tunes when before that they couldn't find, 9 months earlier, they couldn't find even one really. And then
they're a bum group. You know, their music is rubbish. Their studio output is low quality and people don't want to work with them. And then magically they keep getting moved along the chain from all these different gigs in Hamburg to all these auditions and demos. Like they're failing upwards is what you're saying.
Right. They're succeeding in spite of themselves.
Yeah.
So the other thing I should mention also is starting in 1962, they start getting these gigs with the BBC. So now you have to think to yourself, how did that happen? Somebody's pushing buttons behind the scenes. That's how that's working. You were turned down by Decca. You were turned down by George Martin from EMI. And then right after that, the BBC says, yeah, come on onto our BBC Live with the BBC shows. Right? And by the way, they weren't live, folks. They were pre-recorded and they were able to do takes and overdubs. And then they were released like 2 or 3 weeks later. Mm-hmm. So they were actually studio productions. And I did a show on this, Will, where I sincerely doubt that the Beatles are actually performing the instrumentals on those BBC recordings. They did the vocals, but I don't believe that they were doing the instrumentals. That was done by studio players.
Can we take a sidestep real quick to talk about two things? So the first thing I want to do is kind of unpack who George Martin is, because we've said his name a number of times, and the role of a studio producer, a studio engineer in crafting the sound of a band. Because from my time in the studio world and the musicians world, I heard George Martin's name held up with reverence as the guy who basically invented everything that engineers do today. Right, there was a moment when engineering became a straight technical kind of thing to being a creative art. Right. And so George Martin was the guy who started that. And in fact, he's called the fifth Beatle. So let's talk about who George Martin is right now, just to set some context about how important it was that he rejected them. And then this same guy, within a year, took them back on. Let's talk about him for a minute.
Yeah, so a producer, as you know, Will, calls the shots. How the songs are going to be arranged, how the songs are going to sound, the direction, the whole 9 yards. It's the whole presentation and packaging of what this particular album, these songs are going to be about.
The director of an album, like a film director of an album, kind of.
So he's the main man. And that's why the story in the Beatle official narrative that says that George Martin, and I have an interview where he says this, he went out looking for songs for them. In other words, he was pulling in songs that were written by other people. In fact, the Mercy Beat article I mentioned before, September of 1962, says that the Beatles are flying to London to record songs that were specifically written for the group, given to them by their recording manager, their producer, George Martin. It didn't say to record songs written by them. Mm-hmm. It said they were recording songs that were written for them. There's this story that goes around that says that the Beatles pushed back on George Martin and said, no, we don't want to do other people's music. We want to write our own music. And I keep telling people, when people bring that up, I said, look, please put your thinking cap on. You're a band that just got signed. You got turned down twice. you're in the studio with a big name producer. George Martin was the head of the Parlophone label. He wasn't just a producer, he was the head of the Parlophone label. These four guys were not going to tell him anything.
Right.
It was George that was calling the shots. So all these stories about how the Beatles had so much input into what was going on. I mean, I'm not saying that they didn't have discussions with George Martin and might have said, what about this, what about that? But the buck stopped with George Martin.
He was the guy.
And what's interesting is he left EMI because he was having a lot of, how should I say this? I want to put it in the proper context. He was bumping heads with his immediate boss, Len Wood. And George didn't feel when he was at EMI that he was being compensated appropriately, that he should have been making more money. And so George eventually left EMI. And the way the story goes, Len Wood tried to pull him back. He started his own recording studio, AIR, A-I-R Studios. And what's interesting about that is even after he started his own studio, basically an independent studio owner and producer, he was still back at EMI with the Beatles.
Oh, wow.
The point they're trying to make is, obviously, George Martin was very, very important to the operation. Could they have brought a different producer in? Sure. This happens all the time. But no, he stayed. So there's a reason why he was there. And obviously, if you look back at his legacy now, George Martin and the Beatles, it's synonymous.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really talk about the Beatles without talking about George Martin and vice versa. You can't talk about George without having a discussion about the Beatles. He handled them from the beginning in 1962 right up through Revolver. That was his era. And then once Billy came in, because Paul McCartney was out of the picture, he was replaced starting in late 1966 going into Sgt. Pepper, because Sgt. Pepper was Billy's album working with George Martin. The other Beatles were really pretty much spectators at that point. In fact, I think it was a 1990 interview with Bernie Goldberg. Don't hold me to the date, but it was a long time ago. And in that interview, Billy, as Paul McCartney, is telling Bernie Goldberg, who was interviewing him, that George Harrison was a no-show for the Pepper sessions. He said that he was putting a pool in or something. So that calls into question, well, if George was a no-show for the Sgt. Pepper sessions, and he's credited for playing guitar on the tracks, well, who was really playing guitar on those tracks?
Right.
It's not me saying George didn't show up for the Sgt. Pepper sessions. It's Billy, Paul McCartney, telling us that. So anyway, when Pepper came, Billy actually was sharing the production and the whole managing of the band with George Martin. I think personally George was more disciplined and structured in his approach. Billy, I think, was a little more loose. And so the reason why I say that is because when we get to the White Album sessions, George Martin walked out and went on vacation. Again, the reason why I'm telling that story is because we could see there was a transition of management, if you will, within the band from George over to Billy. Mm-hmm. Because Billy really became the de facto manager, handler of the Beatles, taking them in the direction that he wanted them to go. And that started with Billy being responsible for setting the stage with the Beatles for the psychedelic era.
Yes. With
the release of Sgt. Pepper, kicking off the Summer of Love. And he was also behind the Monterey Pop Festival. A lot of people don't know that. He didn't play or perform there as Paul McCartney, but he was working closely with like John Phillips, which, of course, the whole Monterey Pop Festival is tied into the CIA and the distribution of LSD, where local law enforcement was told to stand down as the CIA was handing out acid to the people who attended the concert.
So I think the context that all this is happening in today, in a sense, or is that the Beatles story, as is handed down to us by the official narrative, is as a supernatural one, right? Like you're forced to believe that from 1960 or 1962 to 1969, these going nowhere, poor playing, band members, who just basically are grinding out extended cover sessions in Germany somehow produced under incredibly tight time frames, right, like legendary quality music featuring skills of performance that were outside of their ability, drawing in, musical theory aspects that none of them were trained in, while there's documented interviews and statements that, they were basically bums as a band. And we're supposed to believe that band somehow produced, almost magically this music that defined an era, when there's no evidence to substantiate this, that's what actually happened.
There really is no evidence. The only evidence, and it's not evidence, it's storytelling. It's the official narrative. It's the propaganda. It's the conditioning that comes through official stories. The Beatles narrative, I call it the Cinderella story. Who doesn't love it? Mm-hmm. It's a great story, right? It's a story that says that these 4 working class lads from Liverpool connect with Brian Epstein, and then he winds up getting them signed to EMI under the tutelage of a producer like George Martin, and then they go on to unprecedented fame and fortune. And if you recap what you and I were just talking about, they had nothing. They went from not being songwriters, not being a great band, to then producing in 1963 2 albums, Please Please Me and With the Beatles. So 16 original compositions by the Beatles and 12 cover tunes, 6 on each album. Okay, how was that happening? So then we get to 1964. And by the way, the Beatles were on the hook for 2 albums a year. That was the agreement that they had with EMI. None of this 1 album a year or 1 album every 2 years. They had to produce 2 albums a year. Again, coming from a band that showed no songwriting aptitude and that were mediocre at best as musicians. They were a bar and club band. When you listen to the backing tracks without the vocals, it's very clear what you're hearing there. You're hearing session players playing on those tracks. And you're hearing also different styles of guitar playing, different drumming styles, different bass playing styles, which means that different session musicians were attending different recording sessions. And so their particular style was being reflected on that song. Now, in some cases, the same session players were playing on many tracks, so you're going to hear the same style, but it does change up. So then what happens is when they get to 1964, by the way, they arrive in America on February 7th of 1964. That date is encoded with 9/11. February is 2, 7 is 9, 1964. In numerology, 9 is 0 because anything times 9 reduces to 9. So 1964 becomes 1064. 1 plus 6 plus 4 is 11. It's a 9/11 encoded date. So that gets back into the occult aspects of the Beatles were totally immersed in the occult, totally immersed in Crowleyism, in thelemic principles. Now, they release A Hard Day's Night. That has 13 original tracks on it. There are 13 tracks in total. So now they were able to produce 13 original songs for A Hard Day's Night while they were touring, news conferences, and the filming of the movie A Hard Day's Night was sandwiched in between the recording periods, the dates, of recording the album. So they were on a film set, and that was sandwiched in between the recording that was getting done for the album. Then they get to the second album for 1964, The Beatles for Sale. It goes back to 8 originals, 6 covers. And then they get into 1965, and that's Help. And Help has 14 album tracks, of which 12 are original compositions. You have to really, really important to understand, folks, what their schedule was like. Hectic doesn't even explain it. They were in and out of hotel rooms. They were doing world tours. They were in Australia. They were in the US. They were in Japan. They were playing in Europe, flying everywhere. News conferences, 2 films. When they did Help, the Help album, when they were recording that, the same situation we had with A Hard Day's Night. The filming of the Help movie was sandwiched in between the recording period for the record. How was all this stuff getting done? And then I have an interview that John Lennon gave. It was in the UK Independent. They published it a couple of years ago, where he said on the set of Help, they were in a fog, a haze of marijuana.
Yep.
And that Richard Lester, the director, who was the same director for A Hard Day's Night, had to wrap everything up pretty much by noon, midday, because beyond that, they were useless. They were so stoned. There was no writing of music taking place on film sets. And the proof of that is in an August 5th, 1966 interview with the BBC with John and Paul McCartney said that the Beatles did not write songs in between albums. Maybe 1 or 2. And when he said maybe could mean 0. He said they wrote in great big batches whenever they had to do an album. So that meant 12, 14 songs. And the BBC reporter, it's interesting, the interviewer, he says to Paul McCartney once he says this, he says, well, it seems almost quite impossible to me to bang out 12 songs in a short period of time. And then John Lennon chimes in and says, well, it is at times.
Yeah.
And in that interview, Paul McCartney says it took them weeks weeks to write just one song. And the album they were talking about is Revolver, because they had the interview on August 5th of 1966. And that's when Revolver was released. So they were talking about Revolver. So if it took them weeks to write one song for Revolver, that's when we get into the whole situation where Rubber Soul is the silver bullet that takes the Beatles narrative and turns it upside down on its head.
Yeah.
So they get to 1965 and Help, and then into Rubber Soul, and now they're on the hook for that recording session over a 30-day period of time from October 11th. They arrive in the studio on October 11th. Recording starts on October 12th. They finish up late in the evening going into the early morning hours of November 12th, and they are on the hook for 16 songs.
Impossible.
And they came into the studio with essentially no backlog of music. The
Right.
Beatles came in empty. That's the official narrative. They came in empty. See, I didn't know anything about the Rubber Soul story. And so I found the series, Deconstructing the Beatles. Scott Fryman is the author of this series. Scott's, he's a musicologist. He's he's very well credentialed, but, he presents the Beatles' official narrative. Now, whether he believes it or not, I don't know. But this is what he does with the Deconstructing series. And something told me, a little bird whispered in my head, Mike, pick the Rubber Soul DVD. Don't pick the other ones. Just pick the Rubber Soul one. So, being a musician myself and having recorded and written songs for a long time, when I popped the DVD in, I got 15 minutes into it, and they told the backstory of the Beatles coming off their tour, then had a 6-week break in which they did not write any music. That's in Mark Lewison's book. Mark Lewison's book says that 6-week period of time between when the tour ended on August 31st of 65 to when they arrived in the studio on October 11th of 1965, they had no work. And if anybody thinks that songwriting is not work, I have something to say about that. So they entered the studio with no material. Now, some people will want to argue that they had a little bit of this, they had a little bit of We Can Work It Out, they had a little bit of Michelle. But here's the thing. Having a little bit of something, if you're a songwriter and musician and you're really objective and you're honest, if somebody said to you, I need you to write, learn, in other words, teach the other band members, rehearse, arrange, and record 10, 12, 14 or 16 songs in 30 days, that's not going to happen. And that's what happened with Rubber Soul, Will. When I went in there and I looked at that, when you take a look at how the songs were pumped out, it was conveyor belt stuff.
Yeah.
It was day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. Nobody writes songs and gets them rehearsed and arranged like that. Nobody. I don't know if you're familiar with being in a band, being a musician, or you were in the music business.
Yeah.
But what I try to explain to people is when you go in, when you write music, it's a creative process that takes time. And it's not just about writing music. That's where a lot of people, they get hung up. I get people write me and say, well, I can write that many songs in 30 days. Are you writing good songs?
Right.
The Beatles have pretty much all top shelf songs on Rubber Soul. Let's just say of the 14, 12 really, really solid songs. Some of them are great songs. It's not an album of one good song and 13 filler tracks.
Right.
That's the point that people have to understand. Rubber Soul is considered one of their pivotal albums. It's an album which is considered to have really changed the dynamic within popular music.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some will argue that Dylan set the stage for Rubber Soul, and that's probably true. Although Bob, in an early 2000 interview with Ed Bradley on 60 Minutes, talked about how he made a deal with the chief commander.
Mm-hmm. Can I comment on that real quick?
Yeah, sure.
That interview. So I've heard that clip before. They made a deal with the chief commander of this world, this world, the next one, right? And it's Bob Dylan way. But I've heard that before, but it's what he said afterwards that was so interesting. Because Ed Bradley asked him, could you do that now?
Yes,
he said no. He said, no, I couldn't do that now. I can do other things, but I couldn't do that now. I'd never heard that part of it before. Yeah. That to me was the truly damning part of it. It's like he had a deal to get this done, the legendary songs, and everything else is riding on that. And how many musicians are like that? They've been around. We know their names. They've been around for decades. They had great stuff happening in a defined period of time. And then that period of time ended and they never did anything good again. I think of U2, because U2 is more of my generation, where it's like they had this swing of incredible albums up to the 90s, and then everything they did after that, like, completely forgettable. So I'd never heard that portion of the Dylan interview that kind of speaks to that.
Bob didn't say, well, I'm going to hold up my end of the bargain as long as I still can pump out great tunes. No, he basically said, I had my time, my period of time where I was cranking out the classic Dylan pieces, and after that, it just kind of waned. What he was saying is, I'm still on the hook.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to Rubber Soul, I just took people through it, and I said the rate and pace just doesn't work. And in a June 1966 interview, this was about a little less than a year after Rubber Soul was put out, the Beatles were at the Hilton in Japan. They were asked about their musicianship, and Paul McCartney said, we've always said we're not very good musicians. We're adequate at best.
Right.
And he also said that in the BBC interview 2 months later on August 5th of 1966. So here's the thing, folks. To get songs pumped out the way they did, cranking them out one after another within 30 days for Rubber Soul, you cannot be an adequate musician.
That's right.
You've got to be on top of your game. You have to be a crack studio player. There is no room for error. Let's just put it that way. And what it's telling us also, the songwriting process during Rubber Soul, is everything they touched turned to gold. There was no false starts. There were no songs that they got stuck on. There was nothing that they set aside. Everything they started to write, they completed. Not just the music, but the lyrics as well. Now, anybody who wants to give a crack at writing lyrics to a song, go give it a shot. It's going to take time to write lyrics. And even after you write the lyrics, what will happen is once you go into record, as you're singing a particular lyric that you wrote, you're like, you know what? I don't like the way that's phrased. So you know what? I've got to change that line. I've got to change that phrase or that lyric. That's what I've got to do to make this work. That's how the process works. They want you to think the Beatles just jumped into the studio, put their guitars on and knocked it out. And the other thing I try to explain, Will, and if you've worked in studios, so you know this.
Mm-hmm.
When I record a song, I will go through 4 or 5 different guitars to get the sound that I'm looking for, that I want to hear on the recording. It's not a matter of me just picking up one guitar and saying, well, this'll do. Your amps. What kind of tone am I getting on that amplifier? Getting the sound checks to set up the drums and everything else could take a couple of hours to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Drums have got to be tuned. The drums are not tuned, and it's not going to sound right with the song. And then you get into the whole piece of collaboration with your bandmates. There's always discussion. Sometimes you got to take a break because you got into a heated argument with one of your band members because you just can't get to agree on something. I'm just saying there's a whole dynamic there that is completely not discussed, not addressed with Rubber Soul. They want you to believe that it was just a magical moment, that because of the Beatles, they can do, you mentioned before, supernatural things. That's the story that they're selling to the fans, that they're supernatural. They're way above anything ever before. And what's really unfortunate about that, Will, is I have a lot of musicians, songwriters. I even have some producers and sound engineers I know because they've communicated with me offline. I said to them, you know what the worst part of this to me is that the Beatles were not great musicians. They were not great songwriters. Yet you're trying to strive to that level of songwriting and performance when the fact is they didn't do that.
Amen.
You're listening to people like Bernard Purdy on drums, Ronnie Verrill on drums, Alan White on drums, Andy White on drums, Vic Flick on guitar, Big Jim Sullivan on guitar, Jimmy Page on guitar, Eric Clapton on guitar. That's what you're listening to. So when you're an aspiring musician or even an experienced musician and you're wondering how come I can't get to certain levels and you're beating yourself up because you can't achieve Beatles status, the Beatles never achieved that status because the Beatles aren't on those recorded sessions, especially between 1962 and 66. In fact, a friend of mine worked for and was a good friend of Dan Peake of the band America. Dan was one of the founding members, and George Martin produced America. My friend wrote me and he told me, Mike, just so you know, Dan told me that Jimmy Page played the lead guitar on I Saw Her Standing There. With Ronnie Verrill was a studio drummer. After I released my April 2020 presentation, Did the Beatles Write All the Wrong Music?, I was contacted by one of his relatives. And she said to me, Mike, now that the cat's out of the bag, Ronnie drummed on Beatles songs as well.
Yep.
I have another friend of mine. He was doing work for a professional drummer out of the UK. And I won't say who this person is because I don't want to drag him into the fray.
Sure.
I'm sure he won't appreciate it. My friend said to him, are you a better drummer than Ringo Starr? And so This guy says, I am. And then my friend said, there's a thing out there that says that Ringo wasn't drumming on the Beatle albums, especially between 62 and 66. This guy told him it was true. He said that Bernard Purdie was a very good friend of his. Now, Bernard is a longtime session player, and since the late 70s, he said that he drummed on 21 Beatle tracks.
Mm-hmm.
And in an early 2000 interview that he did with Red Bull, he went through great detail about how that worked and his involvement in that. So there are people that know. A friend of mine, and I consider Mike Stock a friend of mine, Mike is a great songwriter out of the UK. Mike told me that in the early 80s, he was doing some work with Billy. It was some kind of collaboration or whatever. I think he worked with him 2 or 3 times. And he walked into the studio, and Billy was playing guitar right-handed.
Well, Paul McCartney was a lefty.
Paul's lefty. So Billy's naturally right-handed. He had to teach himself to play lefty. And it's not impossible, folks. A lot of people thinking, how could he teach himself to play lefty? Look at some of these Beatle tribute bands. I think the guy in the Beatle tribute band Fab Four, which is a very popular Beatles tribute band here in the States, that guy, I forgot his name, he's righty. He taught himself to play lefty so he could play the part of Paul McCartney on stage in that Beatles tribute band, the Fab Four,
wow.
Which, by the way, they're a very good tribute band. So anyway, the other problem with Rubber Soul, and I know I'm eating up a lot of your time here.
No, this is great.
There's a problem with the manufacturing process, the time frame, the cycle time for the manufacturing process. If you can't or you refuse to get over the hump about the whole ability to write 12, 14, or 16 songs in 30 days, there's the manufacturing bit of it. When I was doing the presentation, I was pulling it together, doing the research, I was working with somebody that has been in the music business for a very long time and very familiar with the vinyl pressing process. The Beatles story tells us that George Martin finished up the sequencing, the order in which the songs are going to play on side A and side B of the album. Sequencing is very important, by the way. The order that songs are on an album is not haphazard. Mm-hmm. It's calculated to ensure that there's the proper amount of dead wax at the end near the label, because as a needle or stylus goes across an album, when it gets closer and closer to the spindle, there is the possibility or the propensity for distortion. To avoid that, especially when you're talking about the big labels, they're going to make sure that they have that album factored out properly so that you don't get that possibility of distortion toward, let's say, the last track or two on an album. Anyway, so he doesn't finish the sequencing until the 16th of November, but we're told that they cut the final mono lacquer. Now, the lacquer is what is used to start the pressing process. And in order to have the records out in stores by December 3rd of 1965. Now remember, the lacquer's cut on November 17th. It's the day after George did the sequencing. From the 17th to December 3rd of 1965 is 2.5 weeks. So we're to believe that they pressed all of those albums within 2.5 weeks and got them into retail on December 3rd of 65. So somebody might say, well, maybe that is possible. But here's the problem. Without the sequencing being complete, you cannot print the center labels of the album because the center labels have the names of the songs in sequenced order. You also cannot print the album jackets, which have the names of the songs on the back of the jacket, the back of the cover, in sequenced order. So there is no way that if George finished the sequencing on the 16th, that they were able to start pressing records on the 17th, the 18th, the absolute latest. And I believe they started pressing on the 17th. But it's possible it could have went into the next day. There's no way. Because they would not have the center labels and the jackets in-house. So what does that tell us? Somebody would say, but Mike, it got done. Yes, it did get done. And you know how it got done? It got done this way. The labels and the jacket already in production being printed weeks before the Beatles showed up in the studio. Before the Beatles showed up in the studio, all that work was underway. How could that possibly be? Because George Martin had professional songwriters writing the songs. And I believe he was one of them. I believe Theodore Adorno may have been one of them as well. Some people say that Adorno wrote all the music. I don't subscribe to that. Adorno was a pretty busy guy with the Frankfurt School. But I think they had probably a staff of 5 to 6 crack songwriters that were turning out the Beatles songs. And one of the people that I was working with during the research of the presentation, exceptional musician, they took a list of the songs and they were saying there are 2 distinct styles at play, two songwriting styles. And he said he believed what they were doing was one group was responsible for writing John Lennon-style songs. And another group, two or three, were responsible for writing Paul McCartney-style types of songs. So that's how they probably managed it, or at least that's a possibility. So the songs were pre-written. George Martin then, while the Beatles were out touring, making movies, doing press conferences, and gallivanting around, he had the studio musicians booked at EMI Studios and recorded the songs. Mm-hmm. So when the Beatles came in to do Rubber Soul on October 11th of 1965, with recording starting on October 12th, what they were doing was recording the vocals to the completed instrumental tracks. The instrumental tracks were already done. Think of it as like singing karaoke. So George Martin worked with them to get the vocals down. They had to learn the songs, and I'm sure the songs came in with a guide vocal.
Oh, something they could listen along to learn.
So they could listen to, maybe guide harmonies, and that was their job. Their job was to listen to that and to get it down. The other red flag with all of the recording is that we're told that not one basic rhythm track took more than 5 takes to nail down.
That's silly.
That's crazy. The White Album, if you take a look at, Mark Lewison's books, on Mark's books, I have 2 of them. We're talking about dozens and dozens and dozens of takes for songs on the White Album. But yet when we go back 3 years in time, back to Rubber Soul, we're told that not one song took more than 5 takes to get the basic rhythm tracks down. That's absurd.
That they had just written. They wrote the song like a couple days before and that's all done, polished. It's awesome. Let's run it. And then we can knock it out in 5 takes. Okay. Maybe you can do that once, but 16 times in 30 days and have to hit the deadline because the printing press needs the stuff. Forget it.
Remember what Paul said in those 2 interviews back in Japan in June of 66 and August of 1966 at the BBC. He said, we're not very good musicians.
Right. That would have to be a lie. They'd have to say, we get in the studio and we kill it. That's who we are. We show up because that's what they would have to say. If it were true, we get in the studio and we crank out 16 top shelf songs, 5 takes out the door, and then we're on tour. We're the best musicians that have ever lived is what he would be saying. Not like, we're okay. Like that's not what he would be saying.
That's right. And the thing is too, there was a lot of thought given to the sound, the production and all that stuff. When you think about what effects are we going to use on this song? What effects go on the guitar?
Mixing.
What effects, mixing and all that stuff. Exactly. So this is the thing, so what happens is you wind up getting into people who don't understand the process want to debate you. But the thing is, I try to do my best to try to point them in the right direction. I don't want to repeat myself. I'll point you to presentations I did where I've explained this, and you can go listen for yourself. So the manufacturing process didn't work either because there's no way all of that stuff, the labels, the center labels, and the album jackets could have been printed and ready to go on the 17th when George Martin just finished up the song sequencing on the 16th. And here's the thing. When you press an album, the center label gets pressed at the exact same time as the vinyl is being pressed. So you can't even argue that, they put the labels on later. No, you don't put the labels on later. The labels get pressed at the same time that the vinyl is being pressed. And then right after that, they go right into the jackets. They get packaged and they get staged for distribution. And then it goes out to the retail outlets. And back in the day, what we have to remember is there were no big box stores. All these shipments had to go out to all these little mom and pop retail outlets, record stores, in order to get Rubber Soul on the shelves in time for Christmas. That's why they had to hit December 3rd, because they had to make sure they had it in stores for a Christmas release. Otherwise, EMI would have been out a tremendous amount of money.
Mm-hmm. That was one of the many convicting things for me is EMI has invested millions of dollars in 1960s money, right? Not even millions of dollars today. We're talking 1960s money to make sure the Beatles, who are the biggest deal in the universe, to make sure that their Christmas album hits stores on time, right? Otherwise, they're out. And so you're telling me that the Beatles walked into the studio 45 days before the deadline from EMI having millions of dollars with 0 songs written, and EMI is just trusting that they're going to show up in the studio and they're going to write the lyrics, they're going to write the music, they're going to learn the lyrics and the music to perform it. It's going to get recorded, mixed, mastered, sequenced, and pressed all within 45 days, or this giant record company with the biggest band in the universe right now is going to be out millions of dollars. I'm sorry, that's not how reality works. That's not how reality works. Exactly.
Back in 1968, I think it was July of 1968, Glenn Campbell, who was with the Wrecking Crew.
Yeah.
So the Wrecking Crew was responsible for just about all of the pop music recordings in the 60s and 70s in the United States, also going into the UK. And the UK had their version of the Wrecking Crew, session musicians that were going from studio to studio playing on different artists' records. But in July of 1968, Glenn Campbell, who was a fabulous guitar player, a virtuoso, was co-hosting the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. And he's introducing Cream. That would be Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, and Jack Bruce. And during that introduction to Cream, he says, these guys were the cream of the crop. They were top studio musicians, and they played on records for the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Tom Jones, the Smothers Brothers themselves. So it was very interesting that we had Glenn Campbell letting the cat out of the bag unintentionally. I mentioned before that they were on the hook for 2 albums a year. So 1963, with everything going on, they still found time to write music. 1964, 2 albums, a film, still found time to write original music for those albums. 1965, the beginning of 65, they put out Help, able to crank out 12 original tracks for the Help album. By the way, I'm not even counting the singles they put out, okay? I'm just talking about the album tracks right now. Then something happened after Help. Everybody fell asleep at the switch. Everybody nodded off because evidently it didn't dawn on them that they were responsible for or on the hook for another album later in the year for Christmas in October of 65 per their contract. Nobody was pulsing them. As an example, after Help was done, you could see they take a little break or whatever, and then you would assume Brian Epstein, who was their manager, would say, hey guys, we got studio time booked in October, so how many songs we need, Brian? 14, 16 songs? Okay, we'll get right on that. Evidently, that conversation never took place. And if you take it a step further, George Martin would have had that conversation as well. So George Martin would have either had that conversation with Brian Epstein, how are they doing on the songs? Because we've got to get things nailed down in October. Or he would have contacted the Beatles themselves and said, hey lads, how are we coming along with those 14 to 16 songs? So the thing is to believe that for the first 5 albums that they found all the time to create original music for those albums, to record them, but it just didn't happen after Help. Everybody just decided they weren't going to do anything. They weren't going to do any songwriting. Okay, well, that's fine. Then we're just going to have to write from scratch in the studio. It's a ridiculous story. The reason why the Beatles didn't write anything between Help and Rubber Soul is because they weren't writing the music. It was being written by professional songwriters. And some folks will say, well, who are these songwriters? I don't know who the songwriters are. Nobody's going to know who these songwriters are. You have to understand the Beatles are a deep state psychological operation that were put in play. They were the first band with the mission to social engineer the world. It would be like asking, give us the whole lowdown on some other big conspiracy. Who were the shooters in the JFK? How come we don't know that? How come nobody has said anything? You have to put it in those terms. It's just too big. And because it's so big and because it's so important, anytime you watch a documentary about the Beatles, anytime you read an article about the Beatles, what is it that they always say in every single one of those articles or presentations? The Beatles were a cultural phenomenon. They changed culture. That itself should tell you what was going on there. They changed culture. Culture was not the same. Music was not the same after the Beatles. The Beatles were the foundation that Tavistock and the Frankfurt School established that all other genres of music were built upon. And the reason for different genres of music is because they know they've got to move on and then they've got to touch a different population, a different generation, a different demographic. Think about punk in the 1970s. What's a punk? A punk is a low life. Go look it up in the dictionary. Punk music, low life music. Think of the other terms, grunge music, grunge. That's an interesting term as well. I tell my audience, Will, is the music and entertainment business is completely controlled cradle to grave. And people will say, well, does that mean everybody is in on it? No, it doesn't mean that. There are those that are born into the system and they get very prominent roles like Billy Shears, which, by the way, in the book, he says his name is William Shepard. Some people think his name is William Campbell. I had a person come on, a great researcher, Stacy. She believes his bloodline actually goes back. It's blue blood going back to the Douglas Hamilton and Percy bloodlines in Scotland. And if anybody's interested, I'll send the link over to Will. Take a look at that presentation because Stacy does an unbelievable job and it's very, very compelling. Can I say definitively that it's true? No, I can't say that, but it's very, very compelling. She did a great, great job of breaking it down. That's the Beatles, social engineering. Crowley's fingerprints, as far as his thelema, his Aeon of Horus, is all over them. And I don't mean the Beatles individually, although if you read the memoirs of Billy Shears, it's very clear that Billy himself is an occultist. But the other band members, I'm going to say that they were probably aware of occultism, but they didn't have the depth of knowledge of the inner circle around them, how they were encasing them in occultism.
Yeah.
As an example, Crowley's book 77 is a one-pager, and it talks about applying your pure will. It's very clear, and it said that anybody that gets in the way of someone applying their pure will, you can kill them. And at the very end, he says, the slaves shall serve. This is in his book 77. Now, Crowleyites want to argue with me and say, no, book 77 and his work is intended for everybody. He wanted to free humanity from the shackles of the Piscean age, the age of oppression, just like the Frankfurt School, talking about oppressors and victims. Crowley's Aeon of Pisces falls right in line with that. And then moving to the age of enlightenment, which would be the age of Aquarius, which is his Aeon of Horus. The Beatles are the Pied Pipers of the Aeon of Horus. And in fact, the word pied means multicolored. Bingo. Look at the Sgt. Pepper album cover and look at how they're dressed. They're multicolored.
Yep. They're
telling you they are the Pied Pipers. And when we talk about Crowley, we're talking about the cult of Dionysus and we're talking about the cult of Pan. It's the old 60s phrase, if it feels good, do it. And before the Beatles, it goes back to the beat movement, the hedonism. They always tied the beat movement into jazz. Jazz is about improvisation. It's about breaking out of the structures and improvising. And that's why, like when I watched an interview one time with Kerouac, there was jazz music played. And you'll see that a lot in a lot of these movies where back in the 50s and the early 60s, where they depict the beatniks, you're always going to get jazz music. So they were making a tie into that as well. I'm not going to beat up on jazz music. I have some jazz records, okay? But I'm just saying that they like to make these connections. Not only are they trying to manipulate you and create behavior modification through social engineering, but they're also communicating to their inner circle with their symbolism and how they present.
There are so many pieces to it. It's so complicated. It's so interlinked, and music plays such a central role in American and Western culture today, particularly pop music. And that in many ways began with the Beatles. Like I describe the Beatles as the spearhead, and this was originally my interest in them. It seemed to me that they were the spearhead that was thrust into American and Western culture that then allowed Eastern mysticism to flow in freely, especially when they went over to India with Maharishi Maharaj Yogi. They were the ones that really brought Eastern mysticism to the consciousness of the baby boomer generation in the second half of the 1960s. Yes. Now, the stage had been set for that for 100 years leading up to that point, going all the way back to the Transcendentalists and much more in Madame Blavatsky. And just real quick about Crowley, in the 1970s, musicians became much more overt about their interest in him. David Bowie was talking about the 1970s, saying it was just a Crowley-esque, kind of time. He said that on camera. The Led Zeppelin bought, I think Jimmy Page bought one of Crowley's houses to record an album in. So it was the pivot point was the Beatles, right? And so Rubber Soul, it seems to me that was really that last moment where they were elevated to this position of massive international prominence on the back of essentially being cultivated up that chain. You bring in the best songwriters whose names we'll never know, the best musicians to produce in quote unquote a short miraculous time frame, though it wasn't, an album that truly shifted things. So we're supposed to believe that it was this organic, supernatural, magical phenomenon, or it was highly engineered, highly polished, put together, and these four young lads were just the face of it who came and sang a few bars and just rode it and wrote it all to fame. It's got to be one or the other, right? Are we going to believe in fantasy? Are we going to believe that our world is this organically evolving series of kind of miracles that produce this culture we're in today? Or are we going to say like, no, this has been engineered specifically? And it all crystallizes in a way around the mythology of the Beatles. Because if you look at them, you say, oh, it's just coincidence and happenstance and miracles. Or was this an engineered phenomenon that was highly effective to produce the cultural shift that they needed to? And unraveling that, I didn't realize how important this question is, but it really does get back to the center of the 1960s myth in many powerful ways.
Yeah, the Beatles story, it's an adult fairy tale.
Yeah.
It really is. It's no different. I say that kids accept Santa Claus not being real far better than adults accept being told that the Beatles were not real. In fact, John Lennon, in an interview that he did back in the early 1970s, I think it was 1971, with Rolling Stone magazine, said the Beatles were a myth, Paul McCartney was a myth, he said Dylan was a myth, and he also said that we were craftsmen. By the time we got to the United States, we were old hands at this stuff. And what he was saying was they were groomed and handled to play the part that they played on the world stage. John Lennon had a lot of faults, there's no question about it, but
sure.
But Lennon, he had moments where he was letting stuff out of the bag. Because I think all of that time, all of those years of having your head in a vice, because that's really what it's like. He wrote the song on his Imagine album, How Do You Sleep, which is the quintessential Paul McCartney, Paul is Dead song.
Oh, really?
Yes. Listen to the song, How Do You Sleep, off the Imagine album.
Okay.
Now that you know more about the conspiracy, listen to what he's saying and what he's singing about in that song. It's a very, very telling piece of work. Going to your point, the Beatles are very important to the controller's agenda, to break down traditional values, to attack traditional religion, in particular Christianity, which the controllers really put the pedal to the metal in 1962. The date we're given in memoirs is September 11th, 1962. September 11th is a very occulted date. It's a day that's considered to be a day of war, whether it be physical or psychological war. And when you look at bands today, during interviews and documentaries, they almost always go back to the Beatles as an influence, always a reference back to them. Because the Beatles are a cult. And Tavistock is very good at creating cults. And they're also very good at reducing adult thinking down to that of a child. Because when you get an adult down to childlike thinking, what happens is they no longer logic and reason the proper way, in a critical way. They come from a position of emotion. They're very emotional. And we see this all the time. And when people become emotional, they lash out, they become belligerent, they become nasty, they name call. All they want to do is get back in their comfort zone. They don't want to critically think. And that's what Tavistock does with these bands. They did it with the Beatles. I mean, when I look at the comments section underneath a official narrative, official story Beatle documentary or video, read the comments. These are adults. These are boomers. These are people who are 60, 70, maybe even 80 years old. And the comments, they're like teenagers.
Yeah.
Because what Tavistock wants to do is to take them back to an earlier time, back to an earlier age, and get you lost in fantasy, to get you lost in escapism, so that you don't focus on the real issues, the real things that are going on in the world.
They want to go back to the halcyon youth, right? In a cloud of pot smoke and falling in love in the grass at Woodstock, when the future was open and we were all free and we let go of everything that had formed the foundation of civilization leading up until that moment. And, it was good back then before we had to go to work and get jobs and have responsibility. We were the revolution. And they want to go back into that moment still. They don't want to acknowledge. I can understand why they don't. Look, I want to believe in adult fantasy too, right? I want to believe, that all the things that I love came about by some miracle. They came down from heaven, and I don't want to see how the sausage gets made. But you know what? The creative process for anyone who engages in it is difficult. It's dirty. It's messy. Being a professional artist in any regard, whether it be a painter or a musician or a filmmaker or whatever, is gruelingly difficult and requires a lot of sacrifice, and there's no romance to it. God willing, you produce a beautiful result, but it's not pretty and it's not a miracle, right? And that's adulthood. So to look at the fantasy of the Beatles and say, no, it was the supernatural force, it's like, can we grow up now, please? Can we look at what happened and see where that led us?
They're worshipped as gods. So we have the lower level gods. And that's what your entertainers, your celebrities, your musicians, your artists, and your Silicon Valley, Elon Musk, that's what they are, okay? They're put there so that you idolize them and worship them. They become Pied Pipers and you follow them. Mm-hmm. That's why they have followers, okay?
Right.
That's why they call them followers. For me, well, I look at this is an individual journey. And for my soul's development, they want you disconnected from source. They want you disconnected from God because that gets in their way. They cannot get things done if you have a belief in a creator, a God, or source. Why is that? Because they want to be the gods. As I mentioned earlier, Yuval Harari says we have become gods through their technology.
And you are a hackable animal.
That's why they've been plugging away at transhumanism for 20 years now. They think time is on their side. I mean, at least I think they thought that. I think now they've reached a point where they're seeing that more and more people are waking up and questioning things. Mm-hmm. I think that they sense that more and more questions are being asked, even if somebody's not fully attuned to or awake to everything I took everybody through here. They know something is wrong and they know something is broken, very broken. People are starting to ask, some very important questions.
Do you have time for a couple more questions? Because you brought up a few things. Okay, cool. So, the first thing that I wanted to ask about is maybe now in this context, now that we have the stage set that of the Beatles trajectory from 1960 in Hamburg up to 1965 Rubber Soul. Like it's a 5-year period where they go from a bum group to producing legendary culture defining music while touring and doing all the stuff the fantasy.
And into Revolver, which was the album after Rubber Soul.
And it was around that point between, I guess it was Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's that Paul McCartney dies. Maybe we can talk about that pivot point. And then after Billy Shears comes in to replace Paul McCartney, different looking dude on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's, that's when they take this psychedelic shift. And I look at that as saying the American culture had been prepared to receive the alternative values of the East. Right, that Christianity had been so, and traditional values had been so upended, had been so subverted, it was basically suspended in midair at this point, that then they just came in and they inserted these other foundations. And that, I look at that as being associated with the Paul McCartney death, so maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
The prevailing theory says that he was killed in a car crash. I believe it's very possible that his dying was a ritual sacrifice. Memoirs talks about this. It's called Death for Success. Now, we were talking about Bob Dylan earlier, right? And Bob making a deal with the chief commander for his success. Take a look at all of the people that are in the 27 Club. And it's not just the 27 Club. There are other musicians that died at different ages, but the 27 Club is very interesting. Jim Morrison, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, allegedly drowning in a pool. And I was watching a documentary, which at the time, his girlfriend at the time never bought that story. John Bonham. Now, we know Jimmy Page was heavily into Thelema and Aleister Crowley.
Yes, he was.
Robert Plant has had some serious stuff happen in his life. Does this have something to do with being attached to all of this dark occultism?
Michael Jordan's father died?
Yep. Eric Clapton lost his son Connor. The Who lost Keith Moon.
Let's see, P. Diddy, Notorious B.I.G., Tupac. Yep.
So we can just go through this stuff and people will argue and say, well, this stuff just happens. But if you look at the entertainment industry, which includes the music industry, and you take a look at how many people die young.
That's right.
It's extremely disproportionate. People will say, well, it's because of the drugs, and it's because of the alcohol, and it's because of the lifestyle. Well, I'm not going to say that's not a contributor. But the sex, drugs, and rock and roll bit, that's all part of the breaking down of society. That whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which I know a lot of you subscribe to because you think Keith Richards is the coolest thing in the world, okay? Coolest guy in the world. The whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing, if you're buying into that, then you've been brainwashed. People will say to me, no, Mike, you're wrong. Drugs make you more creative. Absolutely wrong. Yes. Drugs do not make you more creative. When you are being creative and you're working in a studio, I'll talk from a musician standpoint of songwriting, you have to have a clear mind. You can't be stoned. You can't be drunk doing what it is that you need to get done. It's not going to work. If that were true, then why is it that so many of these rock stars have had to go to rehab, to get themselves cleaned up?
Mm-hmm.
You want an example? Aerosmith.
Oh, yeah.
They lived and breathed sex, drugs, and rock and roll life, and they had to clean up their act. Because what will they tell you? They will tell you because if we didn't, it was over. So the lifestyle, yeah, that can contribute to it. But that doesn't mean it's still not part of the dark occultism, because the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, that whole like mythos is part of the occult aspect of all of this. It's part of the propaganda, the conditioning, and the brainwashing that they're selling to the masses.
This leads into the discussion of what happened with Paul. Like, Paul died. What, did he just randomly die in a car crash and it was covered up? Or was it a ritual, one of the first perhaps ritual sacrifices for fame and fortune? Because from my own experience, I know more about the Beatles, the second half of the Beatles, than I did about the first. I sort of had heard a little bit about Help and all that, and I think I'd never really heard or understood the significance of Rubber Soul until I started watching your videos. I knew about the White Album. I knew about Sgt. Pepper's, right? That's all the stuff that I was familiar with. That's the stuff that, at least for me, carried on through the ages, and that was post-biological Paul. And that's the stuff that really cemented them as true culture shapers. Rubber Soul and Revolver were great albums, but it's the Eastern influence. It's the experimentation. It's the drugs. It's all of this. That's what I remember the Beatles for, not having lived through that era. And so that doesn't come about, again, by accident. None of these stars, they're not organic. None of them, right?
No, they're not. They're not.
Yeah.
I mean, and you're on a good point, because a lot of researchers who do this work will only focus on the replacement of Paul McCartney from late 66 on, basically calling out that Billy is not Paul McCartney.
Mm-hmm.
That's okay. That's important. That's important to cover that. But in order to get to that point, in order to get to the psychedelic era, in order to get to all the social engineering that they were involved in, that they were putting across to their fans and to the masses, you had to understand the setup. How did they get there? How did they have the momentum and the progress to be able to get to the point where they had that much clout?
Yep.
What Tavistock did was to do things incrementally. They couldn't come out with Sgt. Pepper in 1962 or 63. It just wasn't going to work. Mm-hmm. So they started very, very methodically. So the first album, Please Please Me, with the Beatles, just straightforward rock and roll numbers with 8 original compositions, 6 covers that people were familiar hearing. It was a process of acclimation and a process of people assimilating and taking it in. And it was a slow, incremental transformation from where people used to be. Let's just pick a time, 1960, to where they were at by the time they got to 1966. Like, one of the things I point out to folks, to your point, Will, take a look at what society was like in 1960. Fast forward to 1969, and you've got Woodstock.
Mm-hmm.
In less than 10 years, they took it from the cultural and societal norms of 1960 to Woodstock. That's how quickly it progressed. In fact, Woodstock was, we talked before about the Aquarian conspiracy. That was, the tagline for that was, it said Woodstock, and I believe it said an Aquarian exhibition.
Yes, it did.
And because people don't really understand, they don't ask any questions. They don't ask, what does that mean? Why is that there? They're always signaling. They're always putting symbols out there. They're always communicating out. And you just have to have the knowledge, at least some level of knowledge, to be able to pick up on it. A whole lot of social engineering had to take place between 62 and 66 to set the stage for Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour. But Sgt. Pepper was pivotal. It was instrumental when it came out. It just blew people away, and it really defined the summer of love and the counterculture at that point in time.
I remember in your presentations you talked about Let It Be. About, was it Setback or Get Back? That's right, Setback. Yeah, right. Yeah. So it shows I've been watching. So the Get Back documentary, I think, was about what was happening with the production of Let It Be. So we have this mythos that in 1965 they get into the studio with allegedly with no songs written or recorded, and in 30 days they bang out 16 original tunes. Then they get back together for Let It Be at the end, like with additional, like they're 9-year seasoned musicians at this point, to try and do something similar at the very end of their career as they're breaking up. I guess the story that I've heard, I don't know if it's true, is that John had gotten together with Yoko Ono and Yoko Ono was breaking up the group. I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not. But then they try to capture quote unquote lightning in a bottle again. What happened during the recording of that album?
Let It Be, I'll give you my opinion, was a failure. It was a total failure. It was Billy's idea, Paul McCartney's idea, to do Let It Be. And a reason why I believe that he wanted to do it was because he knew that there was no documented, genuine footage of them composing and writing songs in the studio. Everything was told in books, and you'll get videos on YouTube where you're being told that that's them rehearsing or that's them writing or whatever it may be, but there's no footage. It's stills set against audio. Folks, I'm going to tell you, audio can be created, audio can be manipulated. Let me run some examples by you, and we'll get back to Let It Be. This audio that you're listening to, how do you know that it's not the studio musicians doing takes for the songs that they're recording for George Martin? How do you know that? You can't see who's playing guitar, who's on drums, who's playing bass, who's playing keyboards. You can't see any of that. You're just listening to audio. How do you know it's not the Beatles practicing the songs that they were taught to take out on the road? The songs that the Beatles took out on the road are songs that they were taught. They would go to EMI studios and they would learn these songs. And all George Martin had to do, or Norman Smith, was to push the record button. The third example would be, how do you know that it wasn't somebody within EMI? I don't want to say George Martin. It could be George Martin. It could be Norman Smith. At the time, like Norman was their engineer between Please Please Me and Rubber Soul, that they weren't editing and putting tapes together, audio together for the sole purpose of creating that impression. So the thing is, the question I've asked my audience to ponder is this. When they went in to go do Rubber Soul, they knew it was a Herculean task. They knew it was monumental. And if they can pull it off, it would be the most incredible achievement in music, in pop music. 16 songs in 30 days. Where was the film crew? How come nobody thought to bring a camera into the session? And I don't mean a still camera, okay? I'm talking about coming in and taking live footage film of them doing their thing. And you would want to document it. I would think, hey, we're going to take on something here that probably nobody's ever done. So let's document this thing. For historical purposes alone, let's document it. Not done. Not done. So Billy knows that they don't have this. So he says, okay, let's go, let's do Let It Be. Let's do the Get Back sessions, and let's bring a film crew with us. Let's film what goes on. And unfortunately, what happened was nothing happened. So when you watch the original film that came out in the 1970s, I went and saw the film, okay, in the movie theaters. To me, it was depressing because I was watching this band that I put up on a pedestal and I wasn't seeing magic. You really didn't see anything really getting done. And the premise of Let It Be was they were going to do 14 songs. I believe it was 14, 12 to 14 songs. And they said they were going to get that done, write the songs in 2 weeks. Then they were going to do 2 live performances. And after the live performance, those live performances would make their way into a TV special. What wound up happening was the 2 weeks ended up becoming a month, the whole month of January. It's supposed to be the first 2 weeks of January, so the whole month of January goes by. And what did they wind up doing? They wound up doing 5 songs on the rooftop of the Apple building. Playing to who? Playing to nobody. They're playing on a rooftop. The only people that could see them were people that were in buildings where they could look out their window and look down at the rooftop. The sound at the street level was completely distorted because the sound is echoing off the buildings.
Yeah.
So this whole thing with Let It Be, where people want to say, oh, look what they did. They didn't do anything. And the other thing that you're not told is that recording for the Let It Be songs went on after January of 1969, bumping right up into early 1970. A lot of people don't know that Paul McCartney, Billy, erased John Lennon's bass track and re-recorded it. John came in, redid his vocal afterwards. George came in and redid his vocal for You Blue later on. A lot of people don't know that the song I Me Mine was a minute and a half of something that George wrote, and Phil Spector, who was the producer at the time, did some producer studio magic and editing and put the song together so that it would flow out to about 3 minutes. The song Across the Universe was not written during the Get Back sessions or afterwards. That song is from 1968. We're told that One After 909 was written back in the early 1960s. One After 909 is Crowley's law of reversal, doing things backwards. 1 after 909. The Book of the Law was published in 1909.
Oh, wow.
So the one after 909 is 909 and then the one. It's Crowley's Law of Reversal. So you've got two songs on Let It Be that weren't even written from January 69 on. For some reason, Phil Spector put two filler tracks on there, Maggie May and Dig It, throwaway tracks. So when you put it into that context, you have to ask yourself, what did they accomplish with Let It Be? They didn't accomplish anything. That brings me to something that Billy said, which validated my research into whether they wrote all their own music or not. So he did an interview, I think it was on ABC, this one, and he starts talking about Let It Be. He talks about how, I'm going to paraphrase here, that it was an impossible task to get those songs written within a month period of time. So here you have the guy that most people believe is Paul McCartney telling you they couldn't do it. An impossible task. That was in 1969. So they were able to do it in 1965, but they couldn't do it in 1969 when they should have been better musicians. They should have been better songwriters. They have all that experience under their belt. They have all of these albums under their belt, all of the studio work allegedly under their belt. And Billy's telling us, hey, well, it was, frankly speaking, it was an impossible task.
They weren't even touring. They had stopped touring at that point as well.
Right after 1966, they stopped doing it, and they dedicated their time to the studio. And part of that reason is probably because if they had put Billy on stage, it could have been problematic. Who's that? So
doesn't look like Paul.
So Let It Be was an interesting thing, but you got the fan club will sit there and talk about how great it is. And yes, and Peter Jackson, when he did the Get Back documentary, he made the G look like an S. Set back. Who's Set? It goes back to the Egyptian mythology. Osiris, Isis, was known as a great magician. It goes back to Horus, the savior god, and Set, the god of darkness and destruction.
Yep.
So that's why when the World Economic Forum came out and called it the Great Reset, they're talking about Set is back, chaos is back, darkness is back. What Peter Jackson was telling us is Set, the god of darkness, chaos, is back. And the only way that you get out of this is the savior god, Horus, is going to have to battle Set. It's the light versus the dark battle. That's what they were projecting out. This is what they believe, because their belief system, you talk about Crowley and you talk about everything else about the control system, the whole system's occulted. We're being governed and administered to by occultists. And it goes back to the Babylonian mysteries. It goes back to the Egyptian mysteries. That's their spiritual center. That's why you see so much Egyptian symbolism. It's everywhere. Here's an example. Go look at a Dodge Ram truck.
Oh, no.
Look at the emblem, the symbol on the back. You think that's a ram? That's Baphomet. Look at Tesla. Look at the back. It looks like a T, right? You're supposed to believe it's a T. It's Baphomet.
The T?
On the Tesla cars, look at the back trunk.
Okay.
It's supposed to be a T, but when you look at it, knowing what you know, tell me that that's not a depiction of Baphomet.
Oh, I see what you mean. I'll share my screen so everyone who's looking can see what you're looking at. So sharing my screen, you can kind of, like, I've never noticed that before, but yeah, I can look at this and I can actually see like ram's horns.
Pick the first one there.
Yeah, here we go on Wikipedia.
Yeah, take a look at Baphomet's face. You've got the horns and you've got this triangular facial structure.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. Well, I mean, you pointed out in one of your videos, like the similarities between the Google Gmail logo and the Masonic apron. There are all kinds of things that do this. And I think all that stuff is real. And let me just say, from my time studying occultism, I was part of a mystery school, taking one lesson per week over the course of 2 years. Like, this was a dedicated practice. They take their ties to Egypt very seriously. All of occultism, all of Western occultism is said to have issued from Hermes Trismegistus, this great Egyptian master who received the emerald tablet and took all this wisdom in the simple form and broke it into all these different pictograms. It's all based on visualization. It's all based on symbols, 100% based on symbols, that they really do believe this. They really do issue everything back to Egypt.
A lot of people get it because more and more people are getting it, but a lot of people, they think you're crazy when when you talk about how it all goes back to the Egyptian mysteries and Egyptian mythology. And in fact, if you look on the Help album, the UK release, even the American release, but go back to the Help album.
Yeah, let me pull that up.
UK release. Those are all Aleister Crowley.
Oh yeah, that you get in one of your. Yeah, you get into that one of your presentations. Yeah.
Yes, in my presentation on the Beatles and occultism, it's telling the story of Osiris, Isis, Set, and Horus.
I'll share the screen on this so people can see what we're talking about. Hopefully everyone can see this now. And you pointed this out. I looked at this and I thought this was semaphore. You know, like waving of flags, but no, it's not semaphore at all. They're not spelling out help with their arms at all.
You could find every one of these ritual symbols on Thelemopedia. Aleister Crowley's Religion of Thelema. They have their own online encyclopedia. It's called Thelemopedia. You could find all of these under the ritual signs. So, and also if you look at the Beatles' second release with the Beatles, it's all one-eyed symbolism. It's got the shadow effect going.
I'll pull that up with the Beatles so everyone can see it. Like all this stuff is. I mean, it sounds silly. It's an overused phrase, but it really is. It really is like hiding in plain sight. Like they really are telling you like what's up. That's Spotify.
Well, the reason why a lot of people blow through it, Will, is because people have accepted it as part of pop culture.
They do.
And and by the way, pop culture is the culture that was handed to you by the Frankfurt School in Tavistock. If you're Spanish, or if you're Italian, or if you're Mexican, or if you're German, or if you're Russian, you have a traditional culture that goes back for your bloodlines and your ancestry. Well, one of the things that they had to do was erase that. They gave us pop culture. Netflix, hot dogs, beer. That's pop culture, folks.
Yeah. They did the same thing in China. The Great Leap Forward. They erased traditional Chinese culture. They preserved some cultural artifacts, but then presented Chinese culture as beginning in the mid-20th century, as, you know, with some things that they carried over, but everything that existed before that they had to erase. They destroyed whole millions of people to make that entire way of life go away. And so people will gladly talk about, we have communism coming here to America. Indeed, we do. And we can see how communism behaved around the world, erasing their own traditional cultures. We had it here. It just looked a little different because we don't have as long a lineage as a country.
First of all, I think all the world is a stage. Even when we look at Russia, and a lot of people want to put a lot of their eggs in the basket with Russia, you know, the good guys and everything else. But a lot of people don't know. And the reason why I know this is because I watch these videos that have to do with life in Russia. To this day, there's still statues of Lenin, very prominent. That's the Bolsheviks. So you have to ask yourself, why is it still there? The Bolshevik Revolution was a bloody, bloody revolution that instilled Bolshevism into Russia, which ultimately became the Soviet Union. You know, you really have to watch everything, is my point. Well, you have to just keep your eye on everything. Ask a lot of questions.
So just one more question, sort of in two halves. So I want to talk about how things wound down with George Harrison for his last album, Brainwash, because I watched one of your videos that had this. I had seen one yesterday. I watched another one today, and I took another look at that album cover, and I was like, oh my gosh, I see it. And then also, what happened with John Lennon? Because John Lennon was murdered. Why? Because obviously I feel like these are associated. I don't think that it was just a random nut job, like the lone, probably a lone gunman, right? But like I just don't think it was a coincidence. Maybe we can talk about the end of their lives, because I guess Ringo's still around, but no one really thinks about him very much. And then Billy Shears is still around, pretending, you know, LARPing as Paul McCartney. But it seems like something happened with Ringo and John Lennon, particularly at the end of their lives.
We'll start with Lennon first. There is, I want to say I don't even call it a conspiracy. There's speculation that John Lennon was looking to spill the beans. And this actually was in a conversation, an old interview I heard that somebody was having with John Coleman. And I don't know if Coleman agreed with it or not, but you know, this was what was being bantered around. And I don't know if that's the case or not. I really don't. Like I mentioned earlier, John, there were cracks in the dam where he would say things that I'm pretty sure he shouldn't have been saying. He was just kind of like pushing the envelope on certain things.
Yeah.
And like the song, How Do You Sleep? I'm sure when he came out with that song, that was probably like he really shouldn't have done that. And then in talking in an interview with Rolling Stone in 1971, where he said, you know, we were craftsmen, along with saying that they're very good at their craft, he's alluding to Freemasonry because they're referred to as the craft. like I mentioned before, McCartney's a myth, Dylan's a myth, and the Beatles are a myth. He's going about his business saying stuff like that. In the book, it tells us in memoirs that Paul McCartney and John Lennon entered into a Faustian bargain in October of 1963. It's possible that was a consequence of entering into that bargain. Paul went first, if we're to believe there was a ritual sacrifice, and people who understand that this stuff does go on. If you don't believe it, that's okay. I always tell people, it doesn't really matter what you believe because you don't run anything. It's the people that are running the show and their crazy concepts and ideology and their occultism that are unfortunately behind the steering wheel.
Watch any music award show performance.
Exactly.
Whether the Grammys or the MTV video, it's all like you're telling me that they're just it's just play acting. Like you really don't think that these traditions that go back, like Aleister Crowley, he talked about the stuff and spirit cooking. Right, like there are people who talk about this stuff. This is like they might be make believing for the award show, but there are people who really believe this stuff.
Yes, they believe this stuff, and the reason why they introduce it like that is to normalize it, is to bring it into the mainstream. Like when you watch, like you were saying, any of these shows, these ceremonies, the Olympics, you're seeing pyramids, you're seeing all kinds of stuff. Now, in a book, I don't have it here with me, there's a book titled Lennon Prophecy, and the author is Joseph Niezgoda, and Joseph, I think he published a book back in 2008, if I'm not mistaken. He makes a very good case in my mind. I mean, there's nothing concrete, but he believes that Lennon entered into a Faustian bargain in December of 1960. Remember when I said that when the Beatles came back from Hamburg, nothing happened? So he speculates that he may have entered into a Faustian bargain in December of 1960. And he goes into a lot more detail. I'm going to summarize this because of time. And that his Faustian bargain had a 20-year time frame. So his runway was 20 years. So December of 1960 to December of 1980, when he was assassinated, that's the 20-year period of time. In fact, in the book, he gives an example of a Faustian bargain, the actual wording. So that's Lennon's piece of it. And with George Harrison, there was an attempt on George's life, I think it was in 1999, at his estate, Friar Park. Person broke in at 3 a.m. in the morning. He was 33 years old. At 3:30 a.m., there's your 33s. George was 56, which is 11, right? So this person breaks in and proceeds to try to stab George to death. I don't know if you ever heard this story. And the only thing that saved George was his wife. She was able to ward off, to get this guy to back off. Now, in the book, it tells us that in some of these occult circles, there's this thing where there's overkill. I don't know. I'm just telling you what the book is saying. But it's no secret that there was conflict between George and Billy. It went on for a long time. I mean, I would say for at least 10 years or so after the Beatles broke up. The Brainwashed album is George's last album. It's a very telling album. So what George was doing, as he knew he was probably near end of life, was to let everybody know what the Beatles were all about. Very interesting album. First of all, look at the title, Brainwashed, and you see the word rain, capital R, and then you have lowercase a, I, and n. Now, at first glance, you might think to yourself, well, I don't think that means anything. However, in Daniel Estulin's book, he talks about Rain Man. Rain Man is another depiction of Diablo, devil, Satan, making a deal with the Faustian bargain. So the question becomes, is George telling us something about rain? Now, you'll see this also, Beatle pictures where they have umbrellas over their heads. So rain or Rain Man is also depicted with umbrellas. Many times you're going to see music videos that have umbrellas. That's possibly alluding to a Faustian bargain that particular entertainer, artist, celebrity, band has entered into. So that's one piece of it. Yep. But more importantly, if you take a look at the 5 dummies, so George depicts 5 crash dummies. And it's interesting that he used crash dummies. So what does the 5 crash dummies represent? It represents Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, and Billy as the other Beatle.
It's actually surprisingly hard to find.
Yes, it is hard to find.
I'm actually shocked by that because it's cut off. Okay, but I did find a gatefold one, so you can
Okay,
actually
yeah.
see it now. Yeah.
So if you have the actual original vinyl album, what you're going to see is you have the 5 dummies, but the shadows only show 4 bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So what is that telling us? It's telling us, as I mentioned before, there were 5 Beatles because Billy was a Beatle, but you believe there were only 4 because you believe there's only been one Paul McCartney. Paul has always been Paul. And then what we're shown is the TV set. And what the TV set is showing you, one of the dummies has it right in front of them. They're talking about the TV as brainwashing. And take a look at the TV screen. What you have is stars. So stars represent what? The pentagram. That's number 1. Stars represent illumination at night. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Forget about the nonsense story that it was Julian Lennon that drew a picture and John Lennon asked his son, what is that? Oh, that's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. That's a nonsense story. It has 2 meanings. It's LSD. The other one is a nickname for Lucifer is Lucy. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Lucifer in the Sky with Diamonds. I think it's very important for people to look at it and try to understand it.
Can I add something to that real quick that I just noticed? It did not appear to be on the vinyl version, but I see it. I don't know what version this is. The one that we were looking at earlier that was cut off. Maybe it's the CD version. If you look down in the lower right-hand corner, you see 2 things. You see George Harrison's signature, but then there's the Ohm symbol and a cross right next to it.
Yeah.
That's, first of all, I'm not okay with that. But second, like, it's really provocative, especially because George Harrison was the one who sang, was it Hare Krishna, Hallelujah? Trying to merge these two. Yeah, exactly. So again, there's the way that maybe Christian values hadn't been fully subverted in America yet, because that's a multi-generational process that we're still in many ways at the tail end of. So, but like to say that no, all these religions are one. Right, like Hare Krishna, Hinduism, essentially, and Christianity. Really, they're pointing to the same thing. And George Harrison was the guy who embodied that. And in fact, he seemed like the guy who always really genuinely bought the Eastern mysticism thing. Didn't a couple of the Beatles go home because they found that the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi had lusty thoughts or something like that? Like, what happened with that?
Yeah, so what happened? They went to India, and that's when we're told that they wrote 30 songs for the White Album, which is another nonsense story. But they go out to India. Ringo was there for 2 weeks because he just couldn't deal with the food, evidently. Billy left after a month. The only 2 that stuck it out for 2 months was George Harrison and John Lennon. And the Maharishi had the hots for Mia Farrow's sister, who was there, Prudence.
Oh.
But the song Dear Prudence is supposedly written about Mia Farrow's sister, who was there with them, because she was so into the meditation that she never left wherever she was meditating, and they would always find her there. So, won't you come out to play? In other words, won't you stop meditating and come out to play? So no, the Beatles were not all there for the same period of time. Ringo cut out after 2 weeks. Billy was gone after a month. He had business dealings, I think, on the West Coast. George and John stayed, and then they had become disenchanted with the Maharishi because they realized that this allegedly spiritual person was chasing women.
As all the gurus were.
It's quite a story. You know, a lot of the stories we're told about the Beatles they're fantastical stories, and you really have to forego logic and reasoning to believe them.
Yes.
You know? Another story, just quickly here, Will, is we're told that on some unknown date in May of 1968, before the White Album sessions, that the Beatles went to George Harrison's bungalow, and they created what is referred to as the Esher tapes, the Esher demos. And that they recorded 27 demos in one day. Folks.
Yeah.
You're not going to record 27 demos in one day. I am sorry. Not going to happen, okay? And we're told that they wrote 30-something songs in India as a setup going into the White Album sessions. They didn't write 30 songs in India. Billy was gone after a month. Ringo didn't really write anything. And then George and John were out there for 2 months, but they weren't writing music. I mean, first of all, they had all of these activities they had to do with the Maharishi, and they had to meditate and do this and do that. And they went down there with an entourage. So to think that, you know, they were actually sitting down and banging out 30 songs is just not reasonable.
Especially because they didn't pull it off for Let It Be, as we talked about. Here they are at the end of their career. They couldn't do it.
Right. Right. I mean, going back to Please Please Me, the first album, we're told that they recorded 10 of the 14 songs in one day at EMI Studios.
Forget it.
In some kind of 11-hour session. People believe that stuff. And again, people who believe it are people that usually do not understand the process of writing music and recording music and all that stuff. But on the other hand, there are people, musicians that I know, even though they should know better, they refuse to take a step back and say, you know what, I'm a songwriter or I'm a musician and I do recording and so on. Let me take a look at this. They won't do it. They just want to shut it out. And people will also ask me, I keep saying a lot of people, because there are a lot of people that ask me these questions after 8 years. They'll say, well, how come some of these big YouTube channels, these music and guitar channels and stuff like that, they don't talk about it? I said, I'll tell you why. There's one channel that has something like 4 million subscribers. I like the guy. He's very knowledgeable. Sometimes I put his stuff up on my blog. And I'm not going to say who it is, all right, because I really do think he's a good guy. If he started started questioning the official narrative of the Beatles, that 4 million subscriber base that he has, he'll have 14 in a matter of a week because people don't want to hear it. They will not entertain it. So what does that mean? When you have 100,000 subscribers, 1 million subscribers, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, you know what that is? That's a paycheck. Mm-hmm. They could lose a lot of money by not going along with the official narrative. Mm-hmm. And so what do? Even if they do know better, and maybe some of them do, they go along to get along because, hey, I don't want to lose that paycheck. It's the same thing we went through with the whole COVID thing. Yep. The doctors that hung in there that, hey, I've got medical loans, school loans. I can't open my mouth. I'm not going to open my mouth. I'm just going to go along with this thing. And, I'm just doing what I'm told. That was pretty much the line, doing what I'm told. People won't walk from the money if the truth is going to cause them to lose money. Some people will, and God bless those people. But a lot of people, no, they won't do it. And I'm not saying it's an easy decision to make because if you've got a family, you've got a home, you've got all of this stuff that you've got to take care of, you got yourself in a position where if you say something, you can jeopardize all that. Yeah, I mean, I understand it. But my point is that's why a lot of them won't talk about it.
Maybe we can close on this then, and we can talk about, because one of the questions I did want to ask you, I'm not a musician. For those who are just listening, Mike, you have an acoustic guitar and you have an electric guitar and you have on the wall behind you, looks like you've got a keyboard there. So you are actually a musician. When you, and sometimes you'll put your music at the end of some of your videos and also on your YouTube channel, which I'll link in the show notes. When you look at the story, or when you first started cracking the story of the Beatles, and you know how hard you work to write a song or record a song, arrange a song, how much is involved with that process. Really, unless someone has been in a studio, you really don't know how hard it is to record a song. Just how much goes into setup and miking and arranging and mixing and mastering, how much goes into just one song, not to mention the writing process. I felt this in myself. Maybe I don't mean to say that this is how you would feel, but my question was, were you offended as a musician to look at the way the Beatles were held up as being these legendary musicians when everything was provided for them and they were essentially bums? And you have so many hardworking musicians trying to grind out, tracks that they're proud of, right, without the elevation of an entire industry and culture behind them. Do you look at that and because I was kind of offended, but maybe from a musician's perspective, it's a little different.
I would say that I just walked from it. In other words, the luster was completely gone. I just assessed it and sized it for what it was, that they were not what we were told they were. So that was that. And to be honest with you, it made me more appreciative of my writing songs and recording songs, because as I mentioned earlier in the show, many musicians and songwriters are striving for that unachievable, for a lot of people, that unachievable level of Beatle genius and creativity with the music and all that stuff, when in fact, I now know, and many other people know, that they didn't do that. Yep. So what that does is that corrects the bar. So whereas your bar is up here, way up here, and you're looking to get there, and you're really downplaying your own abilities to a certain extent, your own skill level, because you're measuring it against something that you think actually happened. When I figured it all out, that bar up here went away. Mm. And I just got comfortable with, you know what? Hey, I'm just going to do my thing. I don't claim to be the greatest songwriter in the world. I don't claim to be the greatest guitar player, musician in the world, but I think I'm pretty good at what I do, at creating music. I'm comfortable with that. You got to be comfortable in your own skin with where you're at with your abilities and your skill, and not chase a ghost, because that's what the Beatles, a lot of people do. They're chasing a ghost. So that's where I kind of landed with it. I really don't pay them any mind anymore. They got to keep the boomers in the boat. So that's why all this stuff, they keep releasing stuff. And
yeah,
we're way beyond continuing to release Beatles stuff and Beatle records and remastering and remixing and all that stuff. The band hasn't existed in 54 years. And they're still turning out this stuff. So that tells you right there that this is very important, because we're half a century into this thing. And they're still trying to crank out merch and products, because it's a cash cow as well. It feeds the beast. I can listen to the music and have an appreciation now for the craftsmanship that went behind the songwriting, behind the musicianship, and the production. I can appreciate that. And why? Because before I knew any better, that's how I learned. Mm-hmm. That's how I learned music, by listening to Beatle music, thinking it was the Beatles. But I could still go back and listen to what they were doing, or whoever was doing it, and have an appreciation for it. But as far as the four guys themselves, or the five guys,
yeah, you can still enjoy the sounds. You can still enjoy the music for what it is, because it still exists. Just detach it from the mythology. It doesn't have to be about these four guys. Like, this is a beautiful album. This is a powerful album. It's an evocative album. Right. Or this song has a personal attachment to me. But just take it away from the guys. Throw away the social engineering and enjoy the music for what it is.
It's like the Monkees. People are okay with that because they know that the Monkees were not the musicians behind the recording. So people have no problem accepting that. They can still call it a Monkees album. They can still say, I love the Monkees. I love the Monkees music. It's fine. That's exactly how we should look at the Beatles. Look at the Beatles as a much larger play than the Monkees, but it's the same exact model. So if everybody got their heads around that, they could still say, oh, I really like the Beatles music, without getting so emotionally invested in defending a belief system that is believing in something that's a myth. You have to put it into the proper perspective, is all I'm saying. And I know, I'm fighting a losing battle here, because the fan base, the cult, is legion. Tip of a hat to Tavistock and the Frankfurt School for what they did. It was absolutely brilliant.
That's why your work is so valuable. And as we started out talking, you're winding down this project after 8 years and going to leave the material out there for people to enjoy. Yes. So what's next for Mike Williams after the magical mystery tour of your own? Yeah.
So look, I'm going to be 66 years old in a couple of months, and I've got 2 grandchildren, and I have a beautiful wife, my daughter, and my son-in-law. I have my family. My mom is up in age. She's mom's pushing almost 90 years old. I have lots of really good stuff to do with my family and my friends. And actually right now I'm engaged in a music project, which I have named the Yesteryear Project. So the Yesteryear Project is my brother and I are going back and re-recording music that we wrote and recorded back over 40 years ago as demos.
Wow. Okay.
As demos. The songs were never published, but we wrote a lot of really good songs, in my opinion. And so I said to my brother, I said, look, I don't want these songs to sit on a shelf and collect dust. Let's go back and resurrect them. Let's re-record the songs, and let's reimagine the songs, retaining the original essence of the song and the melodies, but let's give it a flavor that is us today, us in our 60s. And that's what we're doing. We've got 4 songs under our belt right now, and I'm looking to get 12 to 15 of those songs done by year-end 2025.
You're not going to get them all done in 30 days in the studio?
Yeah. It's not going to happen. Not going to happen. Yeah. See, that's the thing, right? Here's a case where the songs are already written. Oh. If somebody said to me, can you bang out 16 of your old songs, re-record them in 30 days? I'd be like, no, I'm not doing that. Could I do it? I don't even know if I can do it, because there's just, the whole process of rethinking the songs and redoing them, and the whole, how are you going to produce them? It's no. So anyway, so we're hoping to get, a dozen or so of the songs out. We have more of them. Let's just pick a dozen songs. If we get a little past that, a little below that, that's okay. But let's just put a plan out there. So that's what we're doing right now.
Well, if you put as much care and thoughtfulness into your music work as you have into your Beatles presentations, I think they're going to be pretty amazing. So thank you for all the work that you've, thank you for all the work and all the years of labor and research and effort that you've put in to that work. It's definitely blessed me. And for everyone listening, like everything we've talked about is basically scratching the surface of the amount of material that you've produced. And so, if anyone wants to learn more, where would you like to send them to watch the videos and then perhaps also to listen to your music? Because I want to make sure that you're rewarded for people learning what you have to say musically as well.
Yeah. So just go to my hub website. It's Sage of Quay. SAGEOFQUAY.com, sageofquay.com. Okay. And if you go there, you're going to see a little pale yellow box in the middle of the website, and there's links to all of my platforms. And one of those links takes you to my music website, laboroflovemusic.com. And you get a little bio on me, from a music perspective, and you'll see the Yesteryear project. And I have 2 compilation albums out there. It's called A Decade of Rockers and A Decade of Blues and Ballads, that spans the time period between 2013 and 2023. So, just take a listen. It's rock. It's classic rock. I call it retro rock. Probably for people my age, you'll have an appreciation for it, but it's okay. That's my thing. Classic rock guy.
Well, praise God for you and your work, sir. Thank you so much for all your devoted labors, and may God bless your next endeavors with music and your family.
Thank you, Will. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, sir.